The Eriksson twins, a journey into shared madness. What happens when reality fractures not for one mind but for two? When paranoia becomes contagious and delusion spreads like a virus between siblings who share more than blood. The case of Ursula and Sabina Eriksson challenges everything we think we know about madness, responsibility, and the terrifying power of shared psychosis. This is not just a story of mental illness. This is a story of how two minds can create a reality so distorted, so dangerous, that it leads to motorway chaos, inexplicable violence, and questions that psychiatry still struggles to answer. On May 17, 2008, two Swedish twins boarded a bus from Liverpool to London. They were ordinary women living ordinary lives until something extraordinary and terrifying began to unfold. Ursula and Sabina Eriksson were 40 years old, identical twins who had traveled to the UK for what should have been a simple visit, but within hours of their arrival, they would become the center of one of the most bizarre criminal cases in British history. What started as a routine journey would end in traffic chaos, unexplained violence, and a death that defied all logic. The first signs of trouble emerged on the National Express coach traveling south on the M6 motorway. Passengers later reported that the twins were behaving strangely, speaking in hushed paranoid whispers about being followed. They accused fellow passengers of being criminals, claimed their bags had been tampered with, and insisted that people around them were plotting against them. The paranoia was not subtle. It was aggressive, vocal, and increasingly disruptive. When the bus stopped at Kiel Services, the situation escalated dramatically. The twins refused to reboard, claiming the other passengers were dangerous. They abandoned their luggage, left their belongings behind, and began walking along one of Britain's busiest motorways. What happened next was captured on camera by a BBC film crew who were following traffic police for a documentary called Motorway Cops. The footage would become some of the most shocking and inexplicable video ever broadcast on British television. The twins were walking in the central reservation of the M6, one of the most dangerous roads in the country. Traffic was moving at 70 miles per hour in both directions. Police officers approached them, trying to understand why two women were walking along a motorway, seemingly oblivious to the lethal danger surrounding them. The officers were patient, professional, trying to de-escalate what appeared to be a mental health crisis. They spoke calmly to the twins, asking them to move to safety, trying to understand their concerns. But Ursula and Sabina were operating in a different reality. They were convinced that the police were part of whatever conspiracy they believed was targeting them. They refused to cooperate, insisted they were in danger from unseen enemies, and seemed genuinely terrified of everyone around them except each other. Then, without warning, without any apparent trigger, both twins suddenly broke away from the police officers and ran directly into the oncoming traffic. The footage is horrifying to watch. These were not suicide attempts in any conventional sense. They ran with purpose, as if the 6 lanes of speeding traffic represented safety rather than certain death. Cars swerved, brakes screamed, metal crashed into metal. Ursula was struck first, her body launched into the air by a speeding truck. She hit the ground with devastating force. Seconds later, Sabina was hit by a car traveling at highway speed. The impact should have killed them both instantly, but incredibly, impossibly, both twins survived. Ursula suffered severe injuries including a broken leg and internal trauma, but she was alive. Sabina's injuries were less severe, and she was conscious within hours. The motorway was closed for emergency response. Multiple vehicles were damaged. Other drivers were traumatized. The twins had turned one of Britain's major arteries into a scene of carnage, and somehow they had lived through it. The police were faced with an unprecedented situation. Two foreign nationals had caused a major traffic incident through behavior that appeared to be either criminal recklessness or severe mental illness. The twins were taken to separate hospitals. Ursula, with her more serious injuries, remained in medical care. Sabina, despite having been struck by a car at highway speed just hours earlier, was deemed fit enough to be questioned by police. This is where the story takes an even more disturbing turn. Sabina was arrested and charged with trespass on the motorway. She spent one night in custody, was processed through the court system, and was released the following day. Think about this for a moment. A woman who had just exhibited severe paranoid behavior, who had run into motorway traffic in what appeared to be a psychotic episode, who had caused a major incident that could have killed multiple people, was released back into the community after spending less than 24 hours in custody. She had no support system in the UK, no family nearby, no mental health intervention, no follow-up care. She was simply released to fend for herself. Sabina left the courthouse and began walking. Security cameras tracked her movements through Stoke-on-Trent. She appeared calm, purposeful, but completely alone in a foreign country. She had no money, no identification, no plan. She walked through residential areas, past shops, through parks. People she encountered later described her as seeming lost but not distressed. She asked for directions, made small talk, appeared almost normal, but something was still deeply wrong. That evening, Sabina knocked on the door of a house in the Harplands area of Stoke-on-Trent. The door was answered by Glenn Hollinshead, a 54-year-old man who was described by everyone who knew him as gentle, kind, and helpful. Glenn was a good Samaritan in the truest sense. When he saw a woman who appeared to be in distress, he did what came naturally to him. He invited her in, offered her food, gave her shelter. It was an act of pure human kindness that would cost him his life. What happened in Glenn's house that night remains largely unknown. There were no witnesses, no clear evidence of what triggered the violence that followed. What we know is this. Sometime during the evening, Sabina picked up a kitchen knife and stabbed Glenn Hollinshead multiple times. The attack was sudden, vicious, and seemingly without any provocation. Glenn died from his injuries. This kind, helpful man who had opened his door to someone in need was murdered in his own home by a woman who had no apparent motive, no connection to him, no reason to want him dead. But Sabina's night of violence was not over. After killing Glenn, she took a hammer from his house and began striking herself in the head with it. The self-inflicted injuries were severe, causing significant trauma to her skull and face. Then she left the house and made her way to a nearby bridge over the A50 dual carriageway. Still holding the bloodied hammer, she jumped from the bridge onto the road below. The fall should have killed her. The impact with the road surface caused multiple fractures and internal injuries. But once again, incredibly, Sabina survived. Motorists found her lying on the carriageway, covered in blood from both the murder and her self-inflicted wounds. She was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. The police were called to investigate what initially appeared to be a traffic accident, but the evidence at Glenn's house quickly revealed the horrifying truth. The investigation that followed raised more questions than it answered. Who was Sabina Eriksson? Why had she and her twin sister behaved so bizarrely on the motorway? What had driven her to kill a complete stranger who had shown her nothing but kindness? The Swedish authorities provided background information, but it only deepened the mystery. Both twins had been living normal lives in Sweden. They had jobs, families, no history of violence or serious mental illness. There were no obvious triggers for what had happened. Psychiatrists examining Sabina came to a disturbing conclusion. They believed she and her sister had been suffering from a rare condition called folie à deux, also known as shared psychotic disorder. This is a psychiatric phenomenon where delusions and psychotic symptoms spread from one person to another, typically between people who are emotionally close and socially isolated. In most cases, one person is the primary sufferer who influences the other. But in the case of the Eriksson twins, it was impossible to determine who had been the original source of the paranoid delusions. Folie à deux is rare, poorly understood, and deeply unsettling because it challenges our basic assumptions about individual mental illness. How can madness be contagious? How can two separate minds create a shared reality so distorted that it leads to violence? The condition typically occurs between family members or romantic partners who spend excessive time together and become isolated from outside perspectives. The shared delusions become reinforced through constant interaction, creating a closed loop of paranoid thinking that becomes increasingly divorced from reality. In the case of the Eriksson twins, the shared psychosis appeared to have developed during their journey to the UK. Something had triggered their paranoid thinking, and instead of one twin providing a reality check for the other, they had reinforced each other's delusions. Each twin's paranoia validated the other's fears, creating an escalating spiral of shared madness. By the time they reached the M6 motorway, they were operating in a completely different reality from everyone around them. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and controversial. Sabina was charged with murder, but her mental state at the time of the killing became the central issue. The prosecution argued that despite her apparent psychosis, she had been capable of forming intent to kill. The defense maintained that she had been in the grip of a severe mental illness that rendered her not responsible for her actions. The case highlighted the ongoing challenges in the legal system's approach to mental illness and criminal responsibility. Medical experts testified about Sabina's condition, but their conclusions were not entirely consistent. Some believed she had been completely psychotic at the time of the murder, incapable of understanding the nature or consequences of her actions. Others suggested that while she was clearly mentally ill, she retained enough awareness to be held legally responsible. The question of shared psychosis complicated matters further. If her delusions were influenced by her sister, how much individual responsibility could she bear? The court proceedings revealed disturbing details about the timeline of events. The motorway incident had occurred on May 7. Sabina had been released from custody on May 18. Glenn Hollinshead was murdered that same evening. This meant that less than 48 hours had passed between the twins running into traffic and Sabina committing murder. The system had failed catastrophically. A woman exhibiting clear signs of severe mental illness had been processed through the courts and released without adequate assessment or support. Ursula, still recovering from her injuries in the hospital, was not charged with any crime related to the murder. She had been physically incapable of participating in the violence due to her injuries from the motorway incident. But questions remained about her role in the shared psychosis that had apparently triggered the entire sequence of events. Medical professionals treating her reported that she continued to exhibit paranoid thinking and struggled to accept that anything unusual had occurred. The trial attracted significant media attention, partly because of the shocking nature of the crimes and partly because the entire sequence of events had been partially captured on camera. The BBC footage of the motorway incident was broadcast repeatedly, creating a public fascination with the case that bordered on obsession. The images of two women deliberately running into speeding traffic were so bizarre, so contrary to basic human survival instincts that they seemed almost surreal. Public opinion was divided. Some viewed Sabina as a dangerous individual who had exploited the mental health system to escape full responsibility for murder. Others saw her as a victim of a severe mental illness who had received inadequate care and support. The case highlighted broader issues about how the criminal justice system handles mentally ill defendants and whether the concept of diminished responsibility provides adequate protection for both defendants and society. In the end, Sabina was convicted of manslaughter rather than murder, with the court accepting that her mental illness had significantly impaired her judgment and capacity. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison, a term that many observers felt was inadequate given the severity of the crime. The sentencing judge acknowledged the complexity of the case and the role of mental illness, but emphasized that Glenn Hollinshead's family deserved justice for their loss. The investigation also revealed troubling details about the system failures that had enabled the tragedy. The motorway incident should have triggered immediate psychiatric evaluation and extended mental health detention. Instead, Sabina had been processed as a simple criminal case and released without proper assessment. The police officers involved had recognized that the twins were exhibiting signs of mental illness, but the system lacked adequate protocols for handling such situations. Prison medical staff worked with Sabina throughout her incarceration, attempting to understand and treat her condition. She was prescribed antipsychotic medication and underwent regular psychiatric evaluation. Gradually, her paranoid symptoms appeared to diminish, and she began to show insight into her actions. However, she maintained that she had little memory of the murder itself, claiming that the period around Glenn's death remained largely blank in her memory. The question of what had triggered the shared psychosis was never fully resolved. Investigators found no evidence of drug use, no obvious stressors in the twins' lives, no clear precipitating factors. Some experts speculated that the travel stress, being in a foreign country, or some unidentified trigger had initiated the paranoid thinking. Others suggested that the condition might have been developing gradually over time, only becoming apparent during the crisis. Ursula's recovery was slower and more complicated. Her physical injuries from the motorway incident required multiple surgeries and extensive rehabilitation. Mentally, she struggled to process what had happened, and continued to exhibit signs of paranoid thinking for months after the incident. Swedish authorities eventually arranged for her repatriation, and she received psychiatric treatment in her home country. Her long-term prognosis remained uncertain. The case raised important questions about the nature of criminal responsibility in cases of severe mental illness. If Sabina's actions were the result of a shared psychotic disorder influenced by her sister, to what extent could she be held individually accountable? The legal system struggled with these concepts, ultimately settling on a compromise verdict that acknowledged both her illness and her culpability. Glenn Hollinshead's family were left to grapple with an incomprehensible loss. Their loved one had died simply for showing kindness to a stranger in need. The randomness of his death, the lack of any rational motive, made their grief even more difficult to process. They questioned why someone exhibiting such obvious signs of mental illness had been released without proper evaluation or support. After serving her 5-year sentence, Sabina was released from prison in 20. Her release was controversial, with some arguing that she remained dangerous, and others maintaining that she had served her time and deserved a chance to rebuild her life. Conditions were placed on her release, including ongoing psychiatric monitoring and restrictions on her movements. What happened to Sabina after her release remains largely unknown. She disappeared from public view, apparently returning to Sweden to attempt to rebuild her life away from the intense media scrutiny that had surrounded the case. Some reports suggested she was living quietly, receiving ongoing psychiatric treatment, and attempting to come to terms with what she had done. Others indicated that she continued to struggle with mental health issues, and found it difficult to reintegrate into society. The Eriksson twins case remains one of the most disturbing and inexplicable criminal cases in recent British history. It challenges our understanding of mental illness, criminal responsibility, and the systems designed to protect both individuals and society. The concept of shared psychosis raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of madness, and whether delusions can truly be contagious. The case also highlights the inadequacy of systems designed to handle mental health crises within the criminal justice framework. The gap between recognizing mental illness and providing appropriate intervention proved to be fatal in this instance. Glenn Hollinshead died because a clearly mentally ill individual was released without proper assessment or support. From a psychiatric perspective, the case provides insights into the rare phenomenon of folie à deux, but also demonstrates how little we truly understand about shared psychotic disorders. The mechanism by which delusions spread between individuals remains largely mysterious, and the triggers that initiate such episodes are often impossible to identify. The Eriksson case suggests that shared psychosis can develop rapidly and lead to dangerous behavior with little warning. The motorway incident, captured on camera and broadcast repeatedly, became a cultural phenomenon that raised questions about our fascination with mental illness and violence. The footage was undeniably compelling, but its repeated broadcast arguably contributed to the stigmatization of mental illness and the sensationalization of psychiatric disorders. The case also demonstrated the international complications that can arise when mental health crises cross borders. The Swedish authorities had no indication that the twins were at risk, and the British system was unprepared to handle foreign nationals exhibiting signs of severe mental illness.
Communication between jurisdictions was inadequate, and support systems were virtually non-existent. Years after the events, the case continues to be studied by psychiatrists, criminologists, and legal experts. It has been featured in documentaries, academic papers, and true crime discussions.
The BBC footage remains one of the most shocking pieces of real-life video ever captured, a moment where the camera accidentally documented something that defied explanation. The broader implications of the case extend beyond the specifics of what happened to the Eriksson twins. It raises questions about how society should handle individuals who are clearly mentally ill but have not yet committed serious crimes. Should the system err on the side of protecting individual liberty, even when someone is exhibiting obviously disturbed behavior? Or should public safety concerns override individual rights when mental illness appears to pose a risk? The case also highlights the challenge of predicting violence in mentally ill individuals. Sabina had no history of violence, no obvious risk factors that would have predicted her attack on Glenn Hollinshead. The murder appeared to come from nowhere, making it impossible to prevent through conventional risk assessment methods. This unpredictability remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. The Eriksson twins' story serves as a reminder that mental illness can manifest in ways that are both tragic and incomprehensible. It challenges our desire to find rational explanations for irrational behavior and forces us to confront the limits of our understanding of the human mind. Two women got on a bus for what should have been a routine journey, and by the time their story ended, one man was dead and countless lives were forever changed. The case remains a stark illustration of how quickly mental health crises can escalate and how inadequately our systems are equipped to handle such situations. It demonstrates the deadly consequences that can result when warning signs are ignored or inadequately addressed. Most importantly, it reminds us that behind every criminal case involving mental illness are real people suffering from conditions they may not understand or be able to control. The story of Ursula and Sabina Eriksson continues to haunt those who study it, not just because of its shocking violence, but because of its fundamental inexplicability. In an age where we expect rational explanations for human behavior, the Eriksson case stands as a disturbing reminder that sometimes madness simply defies comprehension, and the human mind remains far more fragile and mysterious than we would like to believe. The death of Sanda, when brotherhood becomes brutality. What happens when tradition becomes torture? When belonging demands the ultimate price? The death of Sanda in December 2018 exposed the dark underbelly of elite fraternity culture in Belgium, revealing how rituals meant to forge brotherhood can become instruments of deadly abuse. This is not just a story about hazing gone wrong. This is a story about power, privilege, and how institutions protect their own even when faced with the most damning evidence of systemic brutality. Sanda was 20 years old when he died. He was a civil engineering student at KU Leuven, one of Belgium's most prestigious universities. He was intelligent, ambitious, and eager to belong to something greater than himself. That desire for belonging would cost him his life. Sanda came from a loving family, the son of immigrants who had worked tirelessly to give their children opportunities they never had. His parents had sacrificed everything to ensure their son could attend university, could build a better life, could achieve the success that had been denied to them. In the autumn of 2018, Sanda was invited to participate in the initiation process for Ruzegom, one of KU Leuven's most exclusive and prestigious fraternities. Ruzegom was not just any student organization. It was an elite club with deep connections to Belgium's political and business establishment. Its members came from wealthy families, attended the finest schools, and were destined for positions of power and influence. To be accepted into Ruzegom was to be granted access to a network that could shape your entire future. The fraternity traced its roots back to 1947, presenting itself as a continuation of ancient university traditions. Members wore distinctive orange ribbons and participated in elaborate ceremonies that they claimed connected them to centuries of academic brotherhood. The organization prided itself on its exclusivity, its traditions, and its ability to transform young men into leaders. But behind the polished exterior and noble rhetoric lay something far more sinister. The initiation process for Ruzegom was known throughout the university as being particularly demanding. Prospective members, called candidates, were required to undergo weeks of what the fraternity euphemistically called challenges. These were presented as character-building exercises designed to test commitment, resilience, and worthiness for membership. In reality, they were systematic programs of physical and psychological abuse designed to break down individual will and create absolute obedience to the fraternity hierarchy. Sanda's initiation began in November 20. Like other candidates, he was required to participate in a series of escalating ordeals that pushed the boundaries of human endurance. The early challenges might seem relatively harmless in isolation, but they were designed to gradually normalize increasingly extreme behavior. Candidates were subjected to sleep deprivation, forced to perform degrading tasks, and required to demonstrate absolute submission to senior members. The fraternity operated under a code of absolute secrecy. Candidates were forbidden from discussing their experiences with anyone outside the organization. They were told that revealing details of the initiation process would result in immediate expulsion and social ostracism. This culture of silence was not accidental. It was deliberately cultivated to ensure that the fraternity's activities remained hidden from outside scrutiny. As the weeks progressed, the demands placed on Sanda and other candidates became increasingly extreme. They were forced to consume excessive amounts of alcohol, subjected to physical violence disguised as tradition, and required to endure conditions that would be considered torture in any other context. The senior members who orchestrated these activities justified them as necessary preparation for the responsibilities of membership. The final phase of Sanda's initiation took place in December 2018, at a rented chalet in the countryside outside Leuven. This was to be the culmination of the process, the ultimate test that would determine whether candidates were worthy of joining the Brotherhood. What happened over those 3 days would expose the true nature of Ruzigam's initiation practices, and ultimately lead to Sanda's death. The chalet was isolated, chosen specifically to ensure privacy and prevent interference from outsiders. Candidates were transported there under conditions of strict secrecy, with no communication allowed with family or friends. They had no idea what awaited them, but they had been conditioned through weeks of increasingly severe treatment to accept whatever was demanded of them. The activities at the chalet were designed to push human endurance beyond all reasonable limits. Candidates were forced to dig holes in the frozen ground with their bare hands, a task made exponentially more difficult by the bitter December weather. They were required to remain in these holes for extended periods, exposed to freezing temperatures that gradually sapped their body heat and strength. The temperature during those December days rarely rose above freezing. The candidates, inadequately clothed and weakened by weeks of abuse, were forced to endure conditions that would challenge even trained survival experts. They were not allowed to warm themselves, were denied adequate food and water, and were subjected to a constant barrage of verbal abuse and physical demands. One of the most disturbing aspects of the initiation was the forced consumption of various substances designed to humiliate and weaken the candidates. Sanda was compelled to drink fish oil, a substance that induces nausea and digestive distress under the best of circumstances. The quantities involved were far beyond what any human should reasonably be expected to consume, but refusal was not an option. Even more degrading was the requirement to consume live goldfish. This practice, borrowed from American fraternity culture, was presented as a test of commitment and courage. In reality, it was a form of ritualized cruelty designed to demonstrate the absolute power that senior members held over candidates. The psychological impact of being forced to consume living creatures was as damaging as the physical effects. The most dangerous element of the initiation involved forced salt consumption. Candidates were required to ingest large quantities of salt, either directly or dissolved in water. The fraternity members who imposed this requirement either did not understand or did not care about the potentially lethal consequences of salt poisoning. The human body can only process limited amounts of sodium, and excessive intake can quickly lead to dangerous electrolyte imbalances. Salt poisoning, medically known as hypernatremia, occurs when sodium levels in the blood become dangerously elevated. The condition can develop rapidly and is potentially fatal if not treated immediately. Symptoms include severe thirst, confusion, seizures, and ultimately coma and death. The fraternity members forcing candidates to consume salt were essentially subjecting them to a form of slow poisoning. In addition to the salt consumption, candidates were forced to remain in freezing water for extended periods. This combination of hypothermia and salt poisoning created a perfect storm of physiological stress that pushed Sanda's body beyond its limits. The cold water lowered his core body temperature, while the excess sodium disrupted his body's ability to regulate fluids and maintain normal cellular function. As the hours passed, Sanda's condition deteriorated rapidly. He began showing clear signs of distress, including confusion, weakness, and difficulty maintaining consciousness. These symptoms should have been recognized as medical emergencies requiring immediate intervention. Instead, they were dismissed by fraternity members as normal reactions to the initiation process. The culture within Ruzigam actively discouraged showing weakness or seeking help. Candidates were expected to endure whatever was imposed upon them without complaint. This toxic mentality meant that even when Sanda was clearly in medical distress, he was pressured to continue rather than receive the care he desperately needed. Senior fraternity members had been through similar ordeals during their own initiations and had survived, leading them to believe that what they were imposing was challenging but not dangerous. This normalization of extreme behavior created a dangerous blind spot that prevented them from recognizing when they had crossed the line from hazing into potentially lethal abuse. The supervision provided during the initiation was inadequate and inappropriate. The fraternity members overseeing the activities lacked any medical training or understanding of the physiological dangers they were creating. They were guided by tradition and peer pressure rather than any consideration of safety or human welfare. As Sanda's condition worsened, his fellow candidates and even some fraternity members began to express concern. However, the rigid hierarchy and culture of absolute obedience within the organization made it difficult for anyone to challenge the proceedings or demand that medical help be sought. The system was designed to suppress dissent and maintain control at all costs. When Sanda finally collapsed, the initial response from fraternity members was not to seek immediate medical attention but to assess whether the situation could be handled internally.
This delay proved fatal. Instead of calling emergency services immediately, precious time was wasted as members debated what to do and whether involving outside authorities would expose the fraternity to legal consequences. The decision to prioritize the fraternity's reputation over Sanda's life was not made by one individual but was the result of a collective mindset that valued institutional protection above human welfare. This mentality had been cultivated over decades and was deeply embedded in the organization's culture. When emergency services were finally contacted, it was too late. Sanda was rushed to the hospital, but the combination of salt poisoning, severe dehydration, and hypothermia had caused irreversible damage to his organs. Despite the efforts of medical professionals, he died 3 days later without regaining consciousness. The immediate aftermath of Sanda's death revealed the full extent of the fraternity's callousness and self-interest. Instead of immediately cooperating with authorities and accepting responsibility for what had occurred, Rusagam members engaged in a systematic cover-up designed to minimize their legal exposure and protect the organization's reputation. Evidence was destroyed or hidden. Fraternity members coordinated their stories to present a unified narrative that downplayed the severity of the hazing activities and shifted blame away from the organization. Electronic communications that might have revealed the true nature of what had occurred were deleted. Physical evidence from the chalet was removed or destroyed. This cover-up was not the panicked reaction of individuals but an organized effort that demonstrated the fraternity's priorities clearly. Even faced with the death of someone they had claimed to accept as a brother, their primary concern was protecting themselves and their institution rather than accepting responsibility or ensuring justice for Sanda's family. The investigation that followed revealed the shocking extent of the abuse that had been inflicted on Sanda and other candidates. Police interviews, medical evidence, and testimony from witnesses painted a picture of systematic torture disguised as tradition. The practices exposed were so extreme that they shocked even experienced investigators familiar with hazing cases. Forensic evidence confirmed that Sanda had been subjected to conditions that would be considered torture under international law. His body showed signs of prolonged exposure to cold, malnutrition, and the effects of forced consumption of harmful substances. The medical examiner's report detailed injuries and physiological damage that could only have resulted from deliberate and sustained abuse. The investigation also revealed that Ruzagam's extreme hazing practices were not aberrations but were part of a long-standing tradition that had been escalating in severity over many years. Former members came forward to describe similar abuse they had endured, creating a picture of an organization that had gradually normalized increasingly extreme behavior. The legal proceedings that followed exposed not only the actions of individual fraternity members, but also the broader culture of privilege and impunity that had allowed such practices to continue unchecked. 18 members of Rusagam were eventually charged with various offenses related to Sanda's death, ranging from assault to involuntary manslaughter. The charges reflected the complexity of the case and the difficulty of assigning individual responsibility within a system of collective action. Some defendants were accused of directly participating in the abuse that killed Sanda, while others were charged with failing to prevent his death or with participating in the subsequent cover-up. The legal process revealed disturbing details about how the fraternity operated and how its members viewed their actions. Evidence presented in court showed that many participants genuinely believed they were engaged in legitimate initiation activities rather than criminal abuse. This disconnect between perception and reality highlighted the dangerous power of institutional culture to normalize extreme behavior. The trial proceedings were closely watched by Belgian society and attracted international attention as an example of how elite institutions can foster cultures of abuse while maintaining facades of respectability. The case became a symbol of broader issues related to privilege, accountability, and the protection of vulnerable individuals within hierarchical organizations. Throughout the legal proceedings, Sanda's family demonstrated remarkable dignity and determination in seeking justice for their son. They refused offers of private settlements and insisted on a full public trial that would expose the truth about what had happened and hold those responsible accountable for their actions. The family's pursuit of justice was complicated by their immigrant background and relative lack of social and political connections compared to the defendants. Many of the accused came from wealthy, influential families with access to top legal representation and political connections. This disparity in resources and social capital became a significant factor in how the case was prosecuted and ultimately resolved. The contrast between Sanda's background and that of his killers became a central theme in public discussions of the case. Here was a young man from a modest immigrant family who had worked hard to earn his place at university, killed by members of an elite fraternity who had been born into privilege and had never faced real consequences for their actions. The investigation revealed that university officials had been aware of concerning reports about Ruzagam's initiation practices but had failed to take adequate action to protect students. This institutional failure to provide oversight and ensure student safety became another focus of public criticism and legal action. The university's response to Sanda's death was widely criticized as inadequate and self-serving. Initial statements focused on protecting the institution's reputation rather than acknowledging systemic failures or committing to meaningful reforms. This response reinforced public perceptions that elite institutions prioritize their own interests over student welfare. As the legal proceedings continued, evidence emerged of a broader pattern of abuse and cover-ups within Belgian fraternity culture. Sanda's death was not an isolated incident, but was part of a systematic problem that had been allowed to persist through institutional indifference and cultural acceptance of extreme hazing practices. The case highlighted significant problems with how Belgian law enforcement and judicial systems handle cases involving elite defendants. Critics argued that investigations were less thorough and prosecutions less aggressive when wealthy, well-connected individuals were involved, creating a two-tiered system of justice. The eventual verdicts in the case sparked widespread outrage and protests across Belgium. Despite clear evidence of their involvement in activities that led to Sanda's death, none of the 18 convicted fraternity members received prison sentences. Instead, they were given suspended sentences, community service, and fines that many viewed as inadequate given the severity of their crimes. The light sentences were seen by many as confirmation of Belgium's two-tiered justice system, where wealthy defendants with good legal representation could escape serious consequences even for the most serious crimes. The contrast between these sentences and the harsh punishments typically imposed on defendants from less privileged backgrounds was stark and undeniable. Public reaction to the sentences was swift and intense. Protests were organized demanding justice for Sanda and reform of both the judicial system and university oversight of student organizations. The case became a rallying point for broader discussions about privilege, inequality, and institutional accountability in Belgian society. The Dia family's response to the lenient sentences was one of dignified outrage. They had cooperated fully with the legal process, believing that justice would ultimately be served. The light sentences felt like a betrayal not only of their son's memory but of their faith in Belgian institutions and the rule of law. The aftermath of the trial saw significant changes in how Belgian universities approach student organizations and hazing practices. New regulations were implemented requiring greater oversight of fraternity activities, mandatory training on hazing prevention, and severe consequences for organizations that violate safety standards. However, critics argued that these reforms were largely cosmetic and failed to address the underlying cultural problems that had allowed Sanda's death to occur. The fundamental power structures and attitudes that enabled elite fraternities to operate with impunity remained largely unchanged. The case also prompted broader discussions about the role of fraternities and similar organizations in higher education. Critics argued that these institutions inherently fostered cultures of exclusivity, privilege, and abuse that were incompatible with educational goals and democratic values. Defenders of fraternity culture argued that the actions of Rusagam were extreme aberrations that did not represent the broader tradition of student organizations. They pointed to positive aspects of fraternity membership, including networking opportunities, leadership development, and charitable activities. The debate over fraternity culture reflected deeper tensions in Belgian society about class, privilege, and opportunity. For many, Sanda's death symbolized the fatal consequences of systems that prioritize the interests of the elite over the welfare of ordinary citizens. The international attention generated by the case brought unwelcome scrutiny to Belgium's elite educational institutions and their connections to political and business power structures. The case became an embarrassing example of how privilege can shield individuals from accountability even in cases involving death. Years after Sanda's death, his family continues to advocate for meaningful reforms and accountability. They have established foundations and initiatives aimed at preventing similar tragedies and ensuring that their son's death serves as a catalyst for positive change, rather than just another example of injustice. The memory of Sanda Dia serves as a powerful reminder of the human cost of institutional failure and the importance of protecting vulnerable individuals from abuse by those in positions of power. His death exposed the dark reality behind the polished facade of elite fraternity culture and challenged Belgium to confront uncomfortable truths about privilege and accountability. The case raises fundamental questions about the nature of tradition and whether practices that cause harm can ever be justified by appeals to history or brotherhood. The rituals that killed Sanda were defended by participants as time-honored traditions, but tradition cannot justify torture or excuse the taking of human life. The systemic nature of the problems exposed by Sanda's death suggests that meaningful change will require more than individual accountability or minor policy adjustments. It will require a fundamental re-evaluation of how elite institutions operate and how society holds them accountable for their actions. The Rusagam case also highlights the importance of speaking out against abuse and the dangers of cultures that demand silence and compliance. The code of secrecy that protected the fraternity's practices also prevented intervention that might have saved Sanda's life. The response to Sanda's death revealed both the best and worst of human nature. While fraternity members prioritized self-protection over justice, others including investigators, journalists, and activists worked tirelessly to expose the truth and demand accountability. The case serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked institutional power and the importance of maintaining vigilant oversight of organizations that wield influence over vulnerable populations. It demonstrates how quickly cultures of abuse can develop and how difficult they can be to address once they become entrenched. For Sanda's family, the fight for justice continues despite the disappointing legal outcomes. They remain committed to ensuring that their son's death leads to meaningful changes that will protect other young people from similar fates. Their courage and persistence in the face of systemic indifference serve as an inspiration to others seeking accountability and reform. The death of Sanda represents more than just a tragic loss of young life. It stands as a symbol of the ongoing struggle between justice and privilege, between accountability and institutional protection. His story reminds us that behind every case of institutional abuse are real people with families who love them and futures that have been stolen from them. The legacy of Sanda should serve as a permanent reminder that no tradition, no matter how ancient or respected, justifies the abuse or endangerment of human life. His death challenges all of us to examine the institutions we support and to demand accountability when they fail to protect those in their care.
When music becomes fatal, the tragic death of Ramón González. What happens when the stage that brings you joy becomes the place where your life ends? When the tools of your passion become instruments of death? The electrocution of Mexican singer Ramón González on stage in 2019 represents a devastating reminder of how quickly celebration can turn to tragedy and how basic safety negligence can have fatal consequences. This is not just a story about a performer's death. This is a story about institutional failures, the dangerous intersection of electricity and entertainment, and how a moment of joy for hundreds of people became a nightmare that would haunt them forever. Ramón González was living his dream. As the lead vocalist of Zafiro, a popular regional Mexican band, he had found success doing what he loved most, performing music that connected with audiences across Mexico. The band specialized in regional Mexican music, a genre that speaks to the heart of Mexican culture and brings communities together in celebration. For Ramón, being on stage wasn't just a job, it was his calling, his way of bringing happiness to others through the power of music. On that fateful evening in November 2019, Zafiro was performing at a private event in the state of Chihuahua, Mexico. The venue was filled with people eager to enjoy an evening of music, dancing, and community celebration. These types of events are cornerstones of Mexican social life, bringing together families, friends, and neighbors to share in the joy of live music and cultural expression. The atmosphere was festive, the crowd was engaged, and everything seemed perfect for what should have been a memorable night of entertainment. The band had likely performed this same set of songs hundreds of times before. They were experienced professionals who knew how to read an audience, how to build energy throughout the evening, and how to create those magical moments where performer and audience become one. Ramón was in his element, doing what he had been born to do, sharing his voice and his passion with people who appreciated and celebrated his art. The stage setup appeared to be standard for this type of event. Microphones, amplifiers, speakers, and lighting equipment arranged to create an engaging performance environment. From the audience's perspective, everything looked professional and properly arranged. The sound system was working correctly, the band was performing well, and the evening was proceeding exactly as planned. No one in the audience had any reason to suspect that deadly danger was literally in the hands of the performer they had come to see. What the audience couldn't see, and what Ramón had no way of knowing, was that somewhere in the electrical system powering his microphone, a critical safety failure was waiting to strike. Faulty wiring, inadequate grounding, or improper electrical installation had created a lethal hazard that would turn a routine performance into a tragedy. The exact technical details of the electrical failure may never be fully known, but the consequences were immediate and fatal. As Ramón sang, gripping the microphone and moving across the stage with the confidence and charisma that had made him a successful performer, electrical current was flowing through pathways it was never meant to travel. The microphone, which should have been perfectly safe to touch and use, had become an electrified instrument of death. Every second he held it, he was unknowingly at risk of the electrical shock that would end his life. The moment of the electrocution was captured on video by audience members who were recording what they thought would be happy memories of a great performance. The footage shows Ramón in the middle of singing, when suddenly his body stiffens in an unnatural way. The electrical current coursing through his body caused his muscles to contract involuntarily, a physiological response that occurs when the human nervous system is overwhelmed by electrical shock. The video reveals the horrifying reality of severe electrical shock. Ramón's body became rigid, his grip on the microphone tightened involuntarily due to the electrical current, and he lost the ability to control his movements. This is a well-documented medical phenomenon called tetanic contraction, where electrical current causes muscles to lock up, making it impossible for the victim to release whatever is delivering the shock. In Ramón's case, this meant he couldn't let go of the microphone even as it was killing him. For a few terrible seconds, Ramón stood frozen on stage, his body locked in position by the electrical current flowing through him. The audience, not immediately understanding what was happening, watched in confusion as their entertainer suddenly stopped singing and became motionless. Some may have initially thought it was part of the performance, a dramatic pause or theatrical moment designed to build tension before continuing the song. The electrical shock that was coursing through Ramón's body was disrupting his heart rhythm and interfering with his nervous system's ability to control vital functions. High-voltage electrical shock can cause immediate cardiac arrest, respiratory failure, and severe burns to internal organs. The human body is not designed to handle electrical current beyond very small amounts, and exposure to household or professional electrical systems can be instantly fatal. As the seconds passed, it became clear to the audience that something was terribly wrong. Ramón's rigid posture was not natural, and the fact that he had stopped singing mid-song indicated that this was not a planned part of the performance. The crowd's mood began to shift from celebration to concern as they realized they were witnessing not entertainment, but a medical emergency. Then, as suddenly as the rigidity had begun, Ramón collapsed. The electrical shock had overwhelmed his body's systems, and he fell to the stage floor. The microphone, still potentially carrying dangerous electrical current, fell with him. Members of the audience who had been recording the performance captured this moment as well, creating a permanent and tragic record of a performer's death. The immediate response from other band members, event staff, and audience members showed the chaos and confusion that follows such unexpected tragedies. People rushed toward the stage, some trying to help, others trying to understand what had happened. However, without proper knowledge of electrical safety, well-meaning rescuers could have put themselves at risk if the electrical hazard was still present. Emergency medical services were called immediately, but the damage had already been done. Electrical shock severe enough to cause the kind of muscular rigidity and collapse that Ramón experienced is often fatal, particularly when it affects the heart and respiratory system. Despite the quick response from emergency personnel, Ramón was pronounced dead at the scene, his life cut short in an instant by a preventable electrical hazard. The video of Ramón's electrocution and death quickly spread across social media platforms, reaching millions of viewers around the world. While some argued that sharing such footage was disrespectful to the victim and traumatic for his family, others contended that it served as an important reminder of the dangers of electrical negligence and the importance of proper safety protocols at live events. The circulation of the video sparked intense debate about the ethics of sharing footage of real deaths and tragedies. Critics argued that viewing and sharing such content was exploitative and harmful to the victim's memory and family. Supporters countered that the video's educational value in highlighting electrical safety issues justified its circulation. This debate reflected broader questions about how society handles graphic content in the age of social media and smartphones. The technical investigation into what caused the electrical failure revealed serious safety violations and negligence in the event's setup. Proper electrical installation for live performances requires multiple safety measures including proper grounding, ground fault circuit interrupters, regular equipment inspection, and adherence to electrical codes designed specifically for entertainment venues. The failure of these systems in Ramón's case represented a preventable tragedy that should never have occurred. Electrical safety in live entertainment is a well-understood field with established protocols and equipment designed to prevent exactly the type of accident that killed Ramón. Professional sound engineers and electrical technicians are trained to identify and eliminate electrical hazards before they can harm performers or audience members. The fact that these safety measures failed in this case pointed to serious negligence by the event organizers and technical staff. The investigation likely revealed violations of basic electrical safety principles that are considered standard practice in the entertainment industry. These might have included improper grounding of electrical equipment, use of damaged or substandard cables and connectors, failure to use ground fault protection devices, or inadequate inspection and maintenance of electrical systems. Each of these failures alone could create dangerous conditions, but combinations of safety violations multiply the risk exponentially. The legal consequences of Ramón's death involved multiple parties potentially bearing responsibility for the tragedy. Event organizers, venue owners, equipment rental companies, and technical staff could all face criminal charges and civil liability depending on their roles in creating the unsafe conditions that led to the electrocution. Mexican authorities opened investigations to determine exactly who was responsible and what charges would be appropriate. The criminal investigation examined whether the electrical failure resulted from criminal negligence, meaning that responsible parties knowingly ignored safety requirements or failed to meet basic standards of care. In many jurisdictions, causing death through gross negligence in safety matters can result in serious criminal charges including involuntary manslaughter or criminally negligent homicide. Civil lawsuits filed by Ramón's family sought compensation for their loss and aimed to hold responsible parties accountable for their negligence. These lawsuits typically focus on proving that the defendants had a duty to maintain safe conditions, that they breached that duty through negligent actions or inactions, and that this breach directly caused the victim's death. The video evidence of the electrocution provided powerful documentation of what happened, though determining who was responsible for the electrical failure required detailed technical investigation. The impact of Ramón's death extended far beyond his immediate family to include his bandmates, the audience members who witnessed the tragedy, and the broader community of Mexican musicians and entertainers. His fellow band members lost not only a friend and collaborator but also had to cope with the trauma of witnessing his death and the end of their musical partnership. The audience members who came to enjoy an evening of entertainment instead experienced a traumatic event that many would struggle to forget. The Mexican entertainment industry responded to Ramón's death with calls for improved safety standards and better enforcement of existing regulations. Professional musicians organizations, venue operators, and technical workers advocated for stricter electrical safety requirements, mandatory safety training, and regular inspections of performance equipment.
The goal was to ensure that no other performer would die from preventable electrical hazards. The tragedy highlighted significant gaps in safety oversight and regulation of live entertainment events in Mexico. While safety standards exist, enforcement is often inconsistent, particularly for smaller venues and private events. Many organizers lack the technical knowledge to properly assess electrical safety risks, and there may be insufficient inspection and certification requirements for equipment and installations. Professional sound engineers and electrical technicians in Mexico and internationally used Ramón's case as an example of why proper safety protocols cannot be compromised even for smaller events or when budgets are tight. They emphasize that electrical safety equipment and procedures are not optional extras, but essential requirements that protect both performers and audiences from serious injury or death. The educational impact of Ramón's death extended to training programs for event organizers, technical staff, and performers themselves. Safety organizations developed new educational materials using his case as an example of how electrical hazards can develop and how they can be prevented through proper planning, equipment selection, installation, and maintenance. The psychological impact on those who witnessed Ramón's death, either in person or through the video, was significant and long-lasting. Witnessing sudden unexpected death is traumatic for most people, and the graphic nature of electrical shock makes it particularly disturbing. Many audience members required counseling and support to process what they had seen and to cope with feelings of helplessness and trauma. The viral spread of the video created a secondary layer of trauma for viewers around the world who saw the footage on social media. While some viewers may have been motivated by curiosity or educational interest, many were unprepared for the graphic nature of the content and experienced psychological distress from viewing a real death. This highlighted the need for better content warnings and age restrictions on platforms that host such material. Ramón's family faced the additional burden of knowing that their loved one's death had been recorded and widely shared. While they appreciated the support and sympathy they received from the public, the constant circulation of the video made it difficult for them to grieve privately and move forward with their lives. They had to balance their desire for justice and safety improvements with their need for privacy and healing. The band Zafiro faced the difficult decision of whether to continue performing after losing their lead singer in such a traumatic way. The surviving members had to cope with their own grief and trauma while also dealing with the practical and emotional challenges of potentially rebuilding their musical career. For many performers who experience such tragedies, returning to the stage can be both healing and re-traumatizing. The venue where Ramón died likely faced significant legal and financial consequences, including potential closure, fines, and civil liability. The reputation damage alone could be sufficient to end the business, as potential customers and performers would be reluctant to use a facility associated with such a preventable tragedy. This economic impact serves as a powerful incentive for venue operators to prioritize safety over cost savings. The case prompted broader discussions about the responsibility of social media platforms to regulate graphic content and protect users from traumatic material. While platforms generally have policies against sharing videos of real violence and death, enforcement is often inconsistent, and content can spread rapidly before it is detected and removed. The debate over platform responsibility continues as technology evolves and graphic content becomes more prevalent online. Professional musicians and performers around the world used Ramón's death as a reminder to advocate for better safety conditions at their own performances. Many began insisting on safety inspections, proper electrical installations, and the presence of qualified technical staff at their events. This grassroots pressure from performers themselves can be more effective than regulations in driving safety improvements throughout the industry. The technical lessons learned from Ramón's death have been incorporated into electrical safety training programs for entertainment technicians. His case is now used as an example of how seemingly minor safety violations can have fatal consequences, and why proper procedures must be followed consistently, regardless of time pressures or budget constraints. Insurance companies that provide coverage for live events have also used Ramón's case to develop stricter safety requirements for their policies. Insurers now often require detailed electrical safety certifications, regular inspections, and compliance with specific technical standards before providing coverage. This market-based approach to safety regulation can be highly effective in driving improvements throughout the industry. The international attention generated by Ramón's death led to increased scrutiny of electrical safety practices in other countries with similar regulatory gaps. Safety organizations and government agencies in Latin America and other regions began reviewing their own standards and enforcement practices to prevent similar tragedies in their jurisdictions. Years after the tragedy, Ramón González is remembered not only as a talented musician whose life was cut short, but as a symbol of the importance of electrical safety in live entertainment. His death sparked meaningful changes in safety practices, regulations, and awareness that have likely prevented other similar tragedies. While this is small comfort to his family and friends, it ensures that his death was not meaningless. The ongoing legal proceedings and safety improvements serve as Ramón's legacy to the entertainment industry. Every safety inspection that prevents an electrical hazard, every properly installed ground fault protector, and every technician who chooses safety over convenience honors his memory and helps ensure that other performers can continue to share their art without risking their lives. The story of Ramón González serves as a powerful reminder that safety cannot be taken for granted, especially in technical fields where the consequences of failure can be immediately fatal. His death challenges all of us involved in live entertainment, from performers to organizers to audience members, to demand and maintain the highest safety standards to protect everyone who participates in these celebrations of music and culture. The tragedy of Ramón González ultimately demonstrates that behind every safety regulation and protocol are real human lives, real families, and real communities that can be devastated when those protections fail. His death continues to inspire efforts to improve electrical safety and entertainment, ensuring that future performers can take the stage with confidence that their passion for music will not become the cause of their death. In the end, Ramón González died doing what he loved, but he should not have died at all. His death was preventable, and the lessons learned from this tragedy must continue to drive improvements in safety practices to honor his memory and protect the countless other performers who deserve to share their gifts without risking their lives.
Germanwings Flight 9525. When mental illness meets aviation tragedy. What happens when the person responsible for protecting lives becomes the one who destroys them? When mental illness intersects with professional responsibility in the most catastrophic way possible? The deliberate crash of Germanwings Flight 9525 into the French Alps on March 24, 2015, represents one of aviation's darkest moments, raising profound questions about mental health screening, privacy rights, and the systems designed to protect both pilots and passengers. This is not just a story about a plane crash. This is a story about how untreated mental illness, institutional failures, and the complex balance between privacy and public safety can converge with deadly consequences. Andreas Lubitz was 27 years old when he made the decision that would end 150 lives, including his own. He was a co-pilot for Germanwings, the budget subsidiary of Lufthansa, living what appeared to be a successful life as a commercial airline pilot. To his colleagues, friends, and family, he seemed to be achieving his childhood dream of flying for a major airline. But behind the facade of professional success, Lubitz was struggling with severe psychological problems that he had been hiding from his employer and aviation authorities. The morning of March 24, 2015, began like any other for the passengers and crew of Germanwings Flight 952. The Airbus A320 was scheduled to fly from Barcelona, Spain to Düsseldorf, Germany, a routine route that the airline operated daily. Among the 150 people on board were families returning from vacation, business travelers, students, and 2 exchange students from a German high school who were returning home after a cultural exchange program in Spain. Captain Patrick Sondenheimer, aged 34, was an experienced pilot with over 6,000 flight hours on the Airbus A3. He had flown for Lufthansa and its subsidiaries for more than 10 years and was known as a competent and professional aviator. That morning, he was paired with co-pilot Andreas Lubitz for what should have been a standard 2-hour flight across the Mediterranean and over the French Alps. The flight departed Barcelona at 10:01 a.m. local time, 3 minutes behind schedule. The initial phase of the flight proceeded normally, with routine communications between the aircraft and air traffic control. The weather was clear, the aircraft was functioning properly, and there were no indications of any problems. Passengers settled in for what they expected to be an uneventful flight to Germany. As the aircraft climbed to its cruising altitude of 38,000 feet, Captain Sondenheimer and co-pilot Lubitz followed standard procedures. Their conversations, recorded by the cockpit voice recorder, were professional and routine. They discussed the flight plan, weather conditions, and operational matters. There was nothing in their interaction that suggested anything unusual was about to occur. At approximately 10:30 a.m., as the aircraft was flying over the French Alps, Captain Sondenheimer left the cockpit to use the lavatory. This was a routine occurrence on flights of this duration, and standard procedures called for the co-pilot to remain at the controls while maintaining radio contact with air traffic control. What happened next would transform a routine flight into one of aviation's most shocking tragedies. Once Captain Sondenheimer was outside the cockpit, co-pilot Lubitz engaged the door lock, a security feature implemented after the September 11th attacks to prevent unauthorized access to the flight deck. The door lock could only be overridden from inside the cockpit, meaning that Lubitz now had complete control over the aircraft with no possibility of intervention from the captain or anyone else. At 10:31 a.m., without warning or communication with air traffic control, Lubitz began descending the aircraft. The descent was not the gradual, controlled descent that would be used for an emergency landing, but a steady, deliberate descent that could only have one purpose. Air traffic controllers immediately noticed the unauthorized descent and attempted to contact the aircraft, but their calls went unanswered. The cockpit voice recorder captured the increasingly desperate attempts by Captain Sondenheimer to regain entry to the cockpit. Initially, he knocked on the door and called out to Lubitz, asking him to open the door. When there was no response, his knocking became more urgent, and his voice took on a tone of growing alarm. He could be heard trying to use the intercom system to communicate with Lubitz, but the co-pilot remained silent. As the aircraft continued its descent toward the mountains, Captain Sondenheimer's attempts to enter the cockpit became increasingly frantic. He could be heard pounding on the door with what sounded like heavy objects, presumably trying to break it down. His voice, recorded by the cockpit voice recorder, showed his growing realization of what was happening and his desperate attempts to prevent the catastrophe he knew was coming. Inside the cockpit, Lubitz remained silent throughout the entire descent. The voice recorder captured only the sound of his breathing, which remained steady and controlled, suggesting a calm and deliberate execution of his plan. He made no attempt to communicate with air traffic control, did not respond to the captain's pleas, and showed no signs of distress or second thoughts about his actions. The aircraft's descent continued at a rate of approximately 3,400 feet per minute, fast enough to ensure that the crash would be unsurvivable, but controlled enough to demonstrate that it was being deliberately executed by someone with aviation knowledge. Air traffic controllers watched helplessly as the aircraft descended toward the mountains, their attempts to make contact going unanswered. Fighter jets were scrambled from a French air base to intercept the aircraft, but there was insufficient time for them to reach Flight 95215 before it crashed. The aircraft was flying over mountainous terrain, where emergency landing options were extremely limited, and the rapid descent meant that even if the pilots had been attempting an emergency landing, the chances of survival would have been minimal. At 10:41 a.m., just 10 minutes after beginning its descent, Germanwings Flight 95215 crashed into the French Alps near the village of Saint-l'Alpe. The aircraft struck the mountainside at high speed, killing all 150 people on board instantly. The impact was so severe that the aircraft was completely destroyed, with debris scattered across a wide area of steep rocky terrain that was difficult for rescue teams to access. The initial response to the crash focused on the possibility of mechanical failure, weather-related issues, or other technical problems that might have caused the aircraft to descend into the mountains. Aviation authorities, airlines, and aircraft manufacturers immediately began investigating potential causes, while rescue teams worked to reach the crash site and recover the victims. The investigation took a dramatic turn when investigators recovered and analyzed the cockpit voice recorder. The recordings revealed the shocking truth about what had happened during the final minutes of Flight 9525. Rather than a mechanical failure or emergency situation, the evidence pointed to a deliberate act by co-pilot Andreas Lubitz to crash the aircraft. The revelation that the crash was a deliberate act sent shockwaves through the aviation industry and the general public. Pilot suicide crashes, while not unknown in aviation history, are extremely rare events that challenge fundamental assumptions about airline safety and the psychological screening of pilots. The fact that a co-pilot had used his position to kill 149 innocent people was almost incomprehensible. As investigators delved deeper into Lubitz's background, a disturbing picture emerged of a young man struggling with severe mental health issues that he had been hiding from his employer and aviation authorities. Medical records revealed that Lubitz had been receiving treatment for depression and had been prescribed antidepressant medications, information that was not available to Germanwings due to German privacy laws. The investigation revealed that Lubitz had been declared unfit to work by a doctor just days before the crash, but he had concealed this information from his employer and reported for duty as scheduled. German privacy laws prevented doctors from directly informing employers about their patients' mental health status, creating a gap in the system that allowed Lubitz to continue flying despite being medically unfit for duty. Further investigation into Lubitz's background revealed a history of mental health problems dating back to his flight training. He had experienced episodes of depression and anxiety during his pilot training, leading to interruptions in his studies. However, he had been cleared to continue training after receiving treatment, and these issues were not considered disqualifying for his pilot's license. The investigation also uncovered disturbing details about Lubitz's internet search history in the days and weeks before the crash. He had researched methods of suicide, cockpit door security systems, and information about previous pilot suicide cases. This evidence suggested that the crash was not an impulsive act, but had been planned in advance. Medical experts who examined Lubitz's case noted that he appeared to have been suffering from what psychiatrists call a psychotic break, possibly related to his underlying depression. This condition can cause individuals to lose touch with reality and make decisions that they would not normally consider. However, the deliberate nature of his actions and the advanced planning suggested that he retained enough awareness to execute his plan methodically. The crash of Flight 9525 raised serious questions about the adequacy of mental health screening for pilots and the balance between privacy rights and public safety. Critics argued that the aviation industry's approach to mental health was outdated, and that pilots were incentivized to hide psychological problems rather than seek treatment, for fear of losing their careers. The case highlighted the fundamental tension between protecting individual privacy and ensuring public safety in professions where psychological fitness is critical. While privacy laws are designed to protect individuals from discrimination based on medical conditions, they can also prevent employers from obtaining information necessary to make informed decisions about workplace safety.
aviation authorities around the world responded to the Germanwings crash by implementing new safety measures designed to prevent similar incidents. The most significant change was the requirement for 2 people to be present in the cockpit at all times during flight. This meant that if one pilot left the cockpit, a flight attendant or another crew member must enter to ensure that the remaining pilot is not alone with the aircraft. The 2-person rule was implemented rapidly across many airlines and aviation authorities, despite some concerns about its effectiveness and practicality. Critics argued that the rule might not prevent a determined individual from committing a similar act, and could create new safety risks by having untrained personnel in the cockpit during critical phases of flight. Beyond the immediate safety measures, the Germanwings crash prompted broader discussions about mental health support for pilots and other safety-critical professions. Aviation authorities began reviewing their approaches to psychological screening, mental health reporting requirements, and support systems for pilots experiencing psychological difficulties. Some airlines and aviation authorities implemented peer support programs, confidential reporting systems, and other initiatives designed to encourage pilots to seek help for mental health issues without fear of career consequences. However, the effectiveness of these programs remains limited by the fundamental challenge of balancing individual privacy with public safety requirements. The investigation into Flight 9525 also revealed concerning details about the aviation industry's response to previous pilot suicide cases. While such incidents are rare, they are not unprecedented, and each case has typically resulted in recommendations for improved screening and prevention measures. However, the implementation of these recommendations has been inconsistent across different countries and airlines. The families of the victims of Flight 9525 faced the additional trauma of learning that their loved ones had been deliberately killed by someone they had trusted to ensure their safety. Unlike accidents caused by mechanical failure or weather, the intentional nature of the crash made it particularly difficult for families to process their grief and find closure. Legal proceedings following the crash were complicated by questions of liability and responsibility. While Lubitz was clearly responsible for the crash, questions remained about whether Germanwings, Lufthansa, aviation authorities, or medical professionals bore any responsibility for failing to prevent the tragedy. Lawsuits were filed by victims' families against various parties, leading to lengthy and complex legal battles. The insurance and legal implications of pilot suicide crashes are particularly complex because they involve intentional acts rather than accidents. Insurance policies typically exclude coverage for intentional acts, but the unique circumstances of aviation create gray areas about liability and compensation for victims' families. The crash also had significant impacts on the reputation and operations of Germanwings and its parent company Lufthansa. The airline faced intense scrutiny about its hiring practices, mental health policies, and safety procedures. While the company was not found to have violated any regulations, the incident damaged public confidence in the airline and led to changes in management and policies. The broader aviation industry also faced questions about its culture and approach to mental health. Critics argued that the industry's emphasis on perfection and zero tolerance for weakness created an environment where pilots were afraid to seek help for psychological problems. This culture, they argued, contributed to the conditions that allowed Lubitz to hide his mental health issues and continue flying. Media coverage of the Germanwings crash was extensive and sometimes problematic. While the public had a legitimate interest in understanding what had happened and why, some coverage focused excessively on sensational details and speculation. The release of information from the cockpit voice recorder, while necessary for the investigation, also raised ethical questions about the privacy of the victims' final moments. One particularly controversial aspect of the media coverage involved claims about a mobile phone video allegedly recorded by a passenger during the aircraft's final descent. Some media outlets reported that such a video existed and described its contents in disturbing detail. However, French authorities consistently denied that any such video had been recovered, leading to questions about the accuracy of these reports and their impact on victims' families. The psychological impact of the Germanwings crash extended beyond the immediate victims and their families to include pilots, flight attendants, and passengers who were forced to confront the possibility that the people responsible for their safety might pose a threat. The crash challenged fundamental assumptions about trust and safety in commercial aviation. Pilots around the world reported feeling stigmatized and under suspicion following the crash, with some experiencing increased anxiety about their mental health and its potential impact on their careers. The aviation industry faced the challenge of addressing legitimate safety concerns while avoiding the creation of a climate of fear and suspicion that could be counterproductive. The crash also had broader implications for discussions about suicide prevention and mental health awareness. Mental health advocates argued that the focus should be on improving treatment and support systems, rather than increased surveillance and restrictions that might discourage people from seeking help. Years after the crash, the aviation industry continues to grapple with the lessons learned from Flight 9525. While new safety measures have been implemented, experts acknowledge that there is no foolproof way to prevent a determined individual with access to an aircraft from causing harm.
The focus has shifted toward improving early detection and intervention systems, while maintaining the trust and cooperation necessary for effective safety management. The case of Andreas Lubitz remains a subject of study for aviation psychologists, safety experts, and researchers interested in understanding the factors that can lead someone to commit such an extreme act. His case is particularly puzzling, because he did not fit the typical profile of someone who commits mass violence, making it difficult to develop effective screening and prevention strategies. The investigation into Lubitz's mental state revealed a complex picture of a young man struggling with depression, anxiety about his career, and possibly other psychological issues that he felt unable to address through normal channels. His decision to commit suicide while taking 149 innocent people with him remains incomprehensible to most observers, and highlights the unpredictable nature of severe mental illness. The tragedy of Germanwings Flight 9525 serves as a stark reminder of the importance of mental health support and the dangers of stigmatizing psychological problems. While privacy rights are important, the case demonstrates that there must be mechanisms in place to protect public safety when individuals in safety-critical positions are experiencing serious mental health crises. The crash also illustrates the limitations of safety systems and the impossibility of eliminating all risks in complex systems like commercial aviation. Despite multiple layers of safety measures, training, and oversight, the deliberate actions of one individual were sufficient to cause a catastrophic failure that killed 150 people. The families and friends of those who died on Flight 9525 continue to cope with their losses and seek answers about how such a tragedy could have been prevented. Their advocacy for improved mental health screening and support systems has contributed to ongoing efforts to enhance aviation safety and prevent similar incidents in the future. The memory of Flight 9525 continues to influence aviation policy and practice around the world. While the specific circumstances of the crash may never be repeated, the underlying issues it revealed about mental health, privacy, and safety in aviation remain relevant and continue to challenge industry leaders, regulators, and mental health professionals. The case of Andreas Lubitz and Germanwings Flight 9525 ultimately represents a failure of multiple systems designed to protect both pilots and passengers. It demonstrates the need for continued vigilance, improved mental health support, and ongoing efforts to balance individual rights with collective safety in professions where the stakes are measured in human lives. The tragedy serves as a permanent reminder that behind every safety system are human beings with their own struggles, limitations, and potential for both heroism and harm. The challenge for aviation and other safety-critical industries is to create environments where people can seek help when they need it, while maintaining the trust and security that make modern transportation possible.
When justice becomes tragedy, the public suicide of Judge Ray Dinkins. What happens when a man entrusted with upholding justice finds himself accused of betraying that very trust? When the weight of public shame becomes unbearable and a cry for vindication transforms into a final desperate act, the suicide of Texas Judge Ray Dinkins at a press conference in 1987 shocked the nation and forced society to confront difficult questions about accountability, mental health, and the devastating power of public disgrace. This is not just a story about political corruption or judicial misconduct. This is a story about how human beings respond when their carefully constructed lives collapse in the most public way possible, and how the intersection of personal crisis and media scrutiny can create tragedies that reverberate far beyond the individuals involved. Judge Ray Dinkins had spent decades building a reputation as a respected member of the Texas legal community. He had served on the bench with what appeared to be distinction, handling cases that affected the lives of countless citizens who trusted in his fairness and integrity. Like many judges, he wielded considerable power within the justice system, making decisions that could determine freedom or imprisonment, guilt or innocence, justice or injustice for those who appeared before him. The world of Texas politics and judiciary in the 1980s was complex and often contentious, with various investigations and scandals periodically shaking public confidence in governmental institutions. Corruption allegations were not uncommon, and the public had grown somewhat accustomed to stories of officials who had abused their positions for personal gain. However, when such allegations touched the judiciary, they struck at the very heart of the justice system's credibility. The specific allegations against Judge Dinkins involved abuse of power and corruption in his judicial duties. While the exact details of the charges varied in different reports, they centered around claims that he had used his position improperly, potentially affecting the outcomes of cases that came before his court. These were serious accusations that, if proven true, would not only end his career, but also cast doubt on every decision he had made during his time on the bench. For someone who had devoted their professional life to the law and had built their identity around being a guardian of justice, such allegations represented more than just legal trouble. They represented a fundamental attack on everything he believed himself to be. The psychological impact of going from respected judge to accused criminal created enormous internal pressure that manifested in ways that those around him may not have fully recognized or understood. As the investigation progressed and media attention intensified, Judge Dinkins found himself in an increasingly desperate situation. The legal process that he had administered for others was now being applied to him, but from the other side. Instead of being the authority figure dispensing justice, he had become the subject of investigation, facing the possibility of criminal charges, disbarment, and the complete destruction of his reputation and legacy. The decision to call a press conference represented Dinkins' attempt to regain control of his narrative and present his side of the story directly to the public. Press conferences by public officials facing serious allegations are common strategies for attempting to shape public opinion and demonstrate confidence in one's innocence. For Dinkins, this may have seemed like his last opportunity to salvage his reputation and convince the public of his integrity. The press conference was scheduled and announced through normal channels, with local media outlets planning to cover what they expected would be a standard political event. Reporters arrived expecting to hear Dinkins' defense against the corruption allegations, to ask pointed questions about the charges, and to report on his responses. No one anticipated that they were about to witness one of the most shocking events in the history of live television news coverage. As reporters and camera crews gathered for the press conference, the atmosphere was likely tense but routine. Dinkins appeared before the assembled media, presumably prepared to make his case for innocence and to answer questions about the allegations against him. The cameras were rolling, capturing what everyone expected would be a newsworthy but conventional political event. What happened next transformed a routine press conference into a tragedy that would haunt everyone present and raise profound questions about media responsibility, mental health awareness, and the human cost of public scandal. Instead of simply proclaiming his innocence and answering questions, Judge Dinkins made a decision that shocked everyone present and created a moment of live television that would be remembered for decades. During the press conference, as cameras rolled and reporters watched, Dinkins produced a gun and, in front of the assembled media, shot himself. The act was sudden, unexpected, and devastating in its finality. The man who had called the press conference to defend his integrity had instead chosen to end his life in the most public way possible, leaving behind questions that would never be answered and trauma that would affect everyone who witnessed the event. The immediate reaction in the room was one of shock, horror, and confusion. Reporters who had come to cover a political story suddenly found themselves witnesses to a suicide. Camera operators who had been filming a routine press conference were now recording a tragedy. The professional distance that journalists maintained between themselves and their subjects collapsed in an instant as they became unwilling participants in a deeply personal and tragic moment. The footage of the suicide was captured by multiple cameras, creating a permanent record of the tragic event. This raised immediate and complex questions about what to do with such material. News organizations faced unprecedented ethical dilemmas about whether to broadcast footage of a public official's suicide, how to balance the public's right to know with respect for the deceased and his family, and what responsibilities they bore for having been present at such a private moment of despair. Some television networks initially broadcast portions of the footage, treating it as breaking news about a significant public figure. However, as the shock of the event settled and the ethical implications became clearer, many organizations pulled the footage from further broadcasts and began internal discussions about appropriate policies for handling such sensitive material in the future. The decision about whether to show the footage created intense debate within news organizations and among media ethics experts. Arguments in favor of broadcasting included the public nature of the event, the fact that it involved a public official facing serious allegations, and the principle that news organizations should report significant events regardless of their disturbing nature. Arguments against broadcasting focused on respect for the deceased and his family, the potential traumatic impact on viewers, and questions about whether showing such footage served any legitimate public interest. The existence of the footage also created lasting ethical dilemmas for the news organizations that possessed it. Even after deciding not to broadcast the suicide itself, they had to determine how to report on the event, what details to include, and how to balance thorough reporting with sensitivity to all involved. These decisions would influence how similar situations would be handled in the future and contributed to the development of more comprehensive ethical guidelines for reporting on suicides. The immediate aftermath of the suicide was chaotic and traumatic for everyone present. Emergency medical personnel were called to the scene, though their intervention came too late to save Dinkins' life. The press conference venue was transformed from a site of political discourse into a crime scene, with law enforcement officers arriving to investigate the circumstances of the death and secure the area. The reporters and camera operators who had witnessed the suicide were suddenly faced with the psychological impact of having seen someone die violently in front of them. Many had covered dangerous situations and tragic events throughout their careers, but few had experienced the shock of watching someone deliberately end their life during what was supposed to be a routine assignment. The trauma of witnessing such an event would affect many of them for years to come. The investigation into Dinkins' death was relatively straightforward from a legal perspective, as the suicide had occurred in front of multiple witnesses and had been recorded on camera. However, the investigation into the original corruption allegations that had prompted the press conference became more complex.
With the primary subject of the investigation dead, prosecutors had to determine how to proceed with a case that could no longer result in criminal prosecution of the accused. The suicide raised questions about whether the original allegations against Dinkins were true, and if so, what impact his death would have on any ongoing investigations or potential civil proceedings. Some argued that his suicide suggested guilt and an inability to face the consequences of his actions. Others contended that the pressures of public scandal and media attention could drive an innocent person to desperation just as easily as guilt could. The family of Judge Dinkins faced the devastating task of grieving their loss while also dealing with the very public nature of his death and the ongoing questions about the allegations that had preceded it. They had to cope not only with the sudden loss of their loved one but also with the knowledge that his final moments had been captured on camera and broadcast to the public. The intersection of private grief and public scrutiny created additional layers of trauma that complicated their mourning process. The impact on the legal system and the judiciary was significant and long-lasting. Dinkins' suicide raised questions about the pressures faced by judges and other public officials, the adequacy of support systems for those facing professional crises, and the potential for similar tragedies in the future. Bar associations and judicial organizations began examining their procedures for handling misconduct allegations and providing support for members facing professional difficulties. The case also contributed to broader discussions about the relationship between media coverage and public accountability. While media scrutiny of public officials is essential for democratic governance, the Dinkins case raised questions about how such coverage should be conducted to minimize the risk of driving officials to desperate acts, while still maintaining necessary oversight of government institutions. Mental health professionals used the Dinkins case as an example of how public shame and professional disgrace can contribute to suicidal ideation, particularly among individuals whose identities are closely tied to their professional roles. For someone like a judge, whose entire career and self-concept were built around being a respected member of the legal community, the prospect of disgrace and criminal prosecution could represent a complete destruction of personal identity. The psychological dynamics involved in the case highlighted the importance of recognizing warning signs of severe depression and suicidal thinking in individuals facing professional crises. Mental health experts noted that the decision to hold a press conference, rather than simply releasing a written statement or having an attorney speak on his behalf, might have been an indication of Dinkins' deteriorating mental state and his desperation to control the narrative surrounding his situation. The case also demonstrated how the modern media environment can intensify the psychological pressure on public figures facing allegations of wrongdoing. The constant coverage, analysis, and speculation can create a sense of being under siege that may be difficult for individuals to handle, particularly if they are already struggling with depression, anxiety, or other mental health issues. Educational institutions that train journalists began using the Dinkins case as a teaching tool for discussing media ethics, particularly regarding coverage of suicide and mental health issues. The case provided a concrete example of how journalists' decisions about what to report and how to report it can have profound consequences for the individuals involved and for society as a whole. The footage of the suicide, while largely removed from broadcast circulation, continued to exist, and occasionally surfaced in discussions about media ethics, historical documentation, and the responsibilities of news organizations. The permanent nature of recorded media meant that the tragic moment could potentially be revisited indefinitely, raising ongoing questions about how such sensitive material should be preserved and accessed. Over time, the Dinkins case contributed to the development of more sophisticated guidelines for reporting on suicide and mental health issues. News organizations developed protocols for how to cover suicides, particularly those involving public figures, with greater attention to the potential impact on viewers, the families of those involved, and the broader community. The case also influenced how law enforcement and judicial institutions handle situations involving officials facing serious allegations. Improved support systems, employee assistance programs, and mental health resources were developed to help individuals cope with professional crises before they reached the point of desperation that led to Dinkins' tragic decision. The broader legal community used the case as an opportunity to examine the pressures and stresses inherent in judicial positions and to consider how the system could better support judges and other legal professionals facing difficult situations. This included discussions about work-life balance, stress management, and the importance of maintaining perspective during professional challenges. The Dinkins case remains relevant today as society continues to grapple with questions about public accountability, media responsibility, and mental health awareness. In an era of social media and instant communication, the pressures that led to Dinkins' suicide have only intensified for public figures facing scandal or controversy. The case serves as a cautionary tale about the human cost of public disgrace and the importance of providing adequate support for individuals in crisis. The ethical questions raised by the case continue to be debated in journalism schools, newsrooms, and academic conferences. How should news organizations balance the public's right to know with concerns about privacy and human dignity?
What responsibilities do journalists have when covering individuals who may be in psychological crisis? How can media coverage serve the public interest while minimizing harm to those involved? The case also highlighted the importance of suicide prevention efforts, particularly for individuals in high-stress professions where public scrutiny is common. Mental health professionals and professional organizations have worked to develop better screening, support, and intervention programs for individuals at risk, recognizing that professional success and public respect do not provide immunity from mental health struggles. The legacy of Judge Ray Dinkins' tragic death extends beyond the immediate circumstances of his case to broader questions about how society handles public accountability, supports individuals in crisis, and balances the sometimes competing demands of transparency, justice, and human compassion. His death serves as a reminder that behind every public scandal and every news story are real human beings with families, feelings, and vulnerabilities that must be considered even as society seeks accountability from its public servants. The case continues to be studied and referenced in discussions about media ethics, judicial administration, and suicide prevention. While the specific circumstances of Dinkins' death were unique, the underlying issues it raised about pressure, shame, mental health, and public accountability remain relevant to contemporary discussions about how society should handle similar situations. The preserved footage and documentation of the case serve as historical records that future researchers and practitioners can study to better understand the complex dynamics involved in public scandals and their human consequences. While the tragic nature of the event makes it difficult to discuss, the lessons it provides about media responsibility, mental health awareness, and the importance of support systems for public officials remain valuable contributions to ongoing efforts to prevent similar tragedies.
The memory of Judge Ray Dinkins and the circumstances of his death remind us that the pursuit of justice and accountability must always be balanced with recognition of human dignity and the need for compassion, even toward those who may have failed in their public duties. His tragic end serves as a call for greater attention to mental health, more thoughtful media coverage of public controversies, and continued efforts to create support systems that can help individuals in crisis find alternatives to despair. The case ultimately stands as a sobering reminder of the fragility of human life and the devastating consequences that can result when professional pressure, public shame, and untreated mental health issues converge in a perfect storm of personal crisis. While Judge Dinkins' death cannot be undone, the lessons learned from his tragedy continue to inform efforts to prevent similar losses and to create a more compassionate approach to public accountability that recognizes both the need for transparency and the human cost of public disgrace. What happens when a moment of trust becomes 7 years of unthinkable horror? When a simple decision to accept help from strangers transforms into the longest psychological experiment in human endurance ever documented? The case of Colleen Stan challenges everything we think we know about survival, the human mind's capacity to adapt to impossible circumstances, and the terrifying power of psychological manipulation. This is not just a story about kidnapping. This is a story about how the human spirit can be both broken and preserved, how evil can masquerade as normalcy, and how one woman's incredible resilience ultimately triumphed over systematic brutality. On May 19, 1977, 20-year-old Colleen Stan was hitchhiking from Eugene, Oregon, to Westwood, California, to attend a friend's birthday party. She was young, optimistic, and trusting in the way that many people were before the world became more cautious about accepting rides from strangers. Colleen had hitchhiked before without incident. It was a common practice in the 1970s, a time when people were more willing to help each other and less aware of the dangers that lurked behind friendly faces. Colleen had already declined several rides that day, following her personal rule of never getting into vehicles with single men. When a blue Dodge Colt pulled over containing a man, a woman, and a baby, she felt safe enough to accept their offer of a ride. The couple seemed normal, even wholesome. The woman, who introduced herself as Janice, was friendly and talkative. The man, Cameron, was quieter but appeared harmless. The presence of the baby reinforced Colleen's sense that these were simply good people offering help to a fellow traveler. Cameron Hooker was 30 years old, married to 19-year-old Janice, and they had an infant daughter together. To all external appearances, they were an ordinary young family. Cameron worked construction jobs, Janice was a homemaker, and they lived in a modest mobile home in Red Bluff, California. Their neighbors saw them as quiet, unremarkable people who kept to themselves. But behind this facade of normalcy, Cameron harbored dark fantasies that he had been nurturing for years. The ride began normally enough. The couple chatted with Colleen about her destination and her plans. They seemed genuinely interested in helping her reach her friend's party. But as they drove further from populated areas, the atmosphere in the car began to change. Cameron became more controlling of the conversation, and Janice grew noticeably quieter and more tense. Colleen sensed something was wrong but was trapped in a moving vehicle with nowhere to go. When Cameron suddenly pulled over on a remote stretch of highway, claiming the car was overheating, Colleen's instincts screamed danger. As she prepared to get out of the car, Cameron produced a knife and ordered her to comply with his instructions. In that moment, Colleen's life changed forever. She was no longer a free young woman traveling to see friends. She had become the prisoner of a man whose twisted psychology would torture her for the next 7 years. Cameron forced Colleen to put her head down and placed a wooden box over her head. The box was crudely constructed but effective in its purpose of sensory deprivation and psychological intimidation. Colleen was completely disoriented, unable to see where they were going or what was happening around her. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. She was stripped of her ability to orient herself in space and time, making her completely dependent on her captors. The drive to the Hooker residence took several hours, during which Colleen remained trapped under the box, struggling to breathe and fighting panic. Cameron used this time to begin the psychological conditioning that would characterize her entire captivity. He established rules that she would be expected to follow without question, threatened severe punishment for any disobedience, and began the process of breaking down her sense of self and autonomy. When they arrived at the Hooker property, Colleen was taken to what would become her prison for the next 7 years. Cameron had constructed a wooden box measuring approximately 3 feet by 7 feet by 3 feet, small enough that she could not stand up or fully stretch out. This box was placed under the couple's bed, literally beneath the foundation of their family life. The symbolism was as cruel as it was practical. Colleen was relegated to existing below the level of human consideration. The initial period of captivity was designed to establish total control over every aspect of Colleen's existence. She was stripped of her clothes, her identity, and her connection to the outside world. Cameron subjected her to various forms of physical torture, including electrical shocks delivered through devices he had constructed specifically for this purpose. The pain was severe enough to be unbearable, but carefully calibrated to avoid causing permanent physical damage that might kill her. The psychological torture was even more systematic and devastating than the physical abuse. Cameron created an elaborate fiction about an organization called the Company that he claimed controlled his actions and had extensive reach throughout the country. According to this fabricated narrative, the Company was a secret organization that specialized in capturing and training individuals to serve as personal property for wealthy clients. Cameron told Colleen that the Company had extensive files on her family and friends, and that any attempt to escape or seek help would result in their deaths. He claimed that the organization had operatives everywhere, including within law enforcement agencies, making it impossible for her to find help even if she managed to escape. This fictional narrative served multiple psychological purposes, explaining why she was being held while simultaneously eliminating any hope of rescue or escape. The story of the Company was supported by elaborate documentation that Cameron created to make his lies more convincing. He showed Colleen contracts that allegedly bound her to serve the Company, rules that governed her behavior, and correspondence that supposedly came from higher-ranking members of the organization. These documents were carefully crafted to appear authentic and to reinforce the hopelessness of her situation. Cameron's psychological manipulation extended beyond the creation of fictional organizations. He systematically worked to break down Colleen's sense of self and replace it with complete dependence on him. He controlled every aspect of her daily existence, from when she could eat to when she could use the bathroom. He determined what she could wear, what she could say, and how she could move. This total control over basic human needs created a psychological state known as learned helplessness. The concept of learned helplessness, first identified in laboratory experiments with animals, describes how creatures subjected to inescapable harmful situations eventually stop trying to escape even when opportunities for freedom become available. In Colleen's case, the systematic removal of all autonomy and the constant threat of severe punishment for any violation of rules created a psychological state where resistance seemed not only futile but dangerous. Colleen spent most of her time confined in the box under the bed, emerging only when Cameron decided to let her out for specific purposes. These periods outside the box were not relief from her torment but different forms of abuse. She was subjected to various forms of physical torture, forced to participate in Cameron's twisted fantasies, and required to perform household tasks while remaining completely subservient. The box itself became both a physical and psychological prison. The space was so cramped that Colleen could not stand, could barely sit up, and had to remain in uncomfortable positions for hours at a time. The isolation was complete. She could hear the family going about their daily lives above her but was completely cut off from human contact, except when Cameron chose to interact with her. The sensory deprivation was severe, with no light, limited air circulation, and only the sounds of footsteps and muffled voices to indicate that the outside world still existed. The physical effects of prolonged confinement were severe and cumulative. Colleen's muscles atrophied from lack of use. Her joints became stiff and painful from being held in cramped positions. Her skin became pale and unhealthy from lack of sunlight and proper hygiene. The psychological effects were even more profound, as her sense of time became distorted and her connection to her pre-captivity identity began to fade. Cameron's control over Colleen extended to manipulating her understanding of time and reality. She was often kept in the box for days at a time with no indication of whether it was day or night, what day of the week it was, or how much time had passed. This temporal disorientation was a deliberate tactic designed to further break down her psychological defenses and make her more dependent on Cameron for basic information about the world.
Janice Hooker's role in Colleen's captivity was complex and evolved over time. Initially, she appeared to be simply following her husband's instructions, perhaps out of fear or coercion. However, as the years passed, it became clear that she was an active participant in maintaining Colleen's imprisonment. She helped care for Colleen when necessary, assisted in moving her between different locations within the house, and participated in the elaborate deceptions that kept Colleen psychologically enslaved. The relationship between Cameron and Janice was itself dysfunctional and abusive. Cameron exercised the same controlling behavior over his wife that he used on Colleen, though to a lesser degree. Janice lived in fear of her husband's temper and his increasingly bizarre demands. She was isolated from friends and family, financially dependent on Cameron, and psychologically manipulated through many of the same techniques he used on Colleen. As the months turned into years, Colleen's captivity settled into a horrific routine. She would spend the majority of her time in the box, emerging only when Cameron decided she was needed for household tasks or when he wanted to subject her to various forms of abuse. The predictability of the routine created a strange form of stability that her mind desperately clung to as a way of maintaining some sense of order in chaos. The psychological adaptation that allowed Colleen to survive her ordeal was both remarkable and heartbreaking. Her mind found ways to cope with unimaginable circumstances by compartmentalizing experiences, creating internal worlds where she could retreat during the worst moments, and developing an almost superhuman ability to endure physical and emotional pain. These coping mechanisms were essential for her survival but came at an enormous psychological cost. Cameron's treatment of Colleen was not consistently brutal. He occasionally showed her small kindnesses or allowed her minor privileges, creating a psychological dynamic known as intermittent reinforcement. This pattern of unpredictable rewards and punishments is one of the most powerful forms of behavioral conditioning, creating strong emotional bonds between captor and victim, even in situations of extreme abuse. The most psychologically devastating aspect of Colleen's captivity may have been the way Cameron systematically destroyed her connections to her previous life and identity. He forced her to write letters to her family explaining that she was fine and had chosen to disappear. These letters, dictated by Cameron but written in Colleen's hand, served to prevent search efforts and to make Colleen complicit in her own disappearance. The letters to her family were particularly cruel because they used Colleen's own words to lie to the people who loved her most. Cameron carefully crafted messages that would sound like Colleen's voice while explaining away her absence in ways that would discourage further contact. The psychological impact on Colleen of being forced to deceive her family was devastating, creating additional guilt and shame that further isolated her from any hope of rescue. In 1981, after 4 years of captivity, Cameron made a decision that demonstrated both his confidence in his psychological control over Colleen and his own twisted sense of power. He allowed her to visit her family, presenting this as a privilege granted by the company for her good behavior. The visit was presented as a test of her loyalty and obedience, with the understanding that any attempt to reveal her situation would result in death for both her and her family. The visit to her family was perhaps the most psychologically complex period of Colleen's entire ordeal. After years of imprisonment and systematic psychological manipulation, she found herself in the presence of people who loved her and wanted to help her, yet she was unable to ask for that help. The conditioning she had undergone was so complete that even when presented with obvious opportunities for escape, she could not take advantage of them. Colleen's family noticed that she seemed different, quieter, more withdrawn, and strangely deferential, but they attributed these changes to natural maturation and life experiences. They were overjoyed to see her and wanted to support her in whatever way they could, but they had no idea that she was being held captive and tortured. The cognitive dissonance between her family's love and acceptance and her own internal reality must have been overwhelming. During the visit, Colleen was in constant contact with Cameron, who monitored her activities and reminded her of the consequences of betraying the company. She was required to call him regularly, report on her activities, and follow specific instructions about what she could and could not do. Even in the presence of her family, she remained psychologically imprisoned by Cameron's threats and conditioning. The decision to return to captivity after the family visit demonstrates the profound psychological control that Cameron had established over Colleen. Despite being physically free and surrounded by people who would have helped her, she voluntarily returned to a situation that she knew would involve continued torture and imprisonment. This choice was not rational in any conventional sense, but was the result of years of systematic psychological manipulation. Cameron's confidence in his control over Colleen was so complete that he began to allow her more freedom of movement within the house, and even outside. She was permitted to work in the garden, help with household tasks, and occasionally interact with neighbors. To outside observers, she appeared to be a quiet, submissive woman, who was perhaps a bit odd, but not obviously in distress. The normalization of Colleen's presence in the Hooker household was another form of psychological torture. She was forced to participate in the facade of normal family life, while remaining a prisoner. She helped care for Cameron and Janice's children, participated in household routines, and even attended some social functions, all while knowing that any deviation from Cameron's expectations would result in severe punishment. The years of captivity took an enormous toll on Colleen's physical and mental health. She suffered from chronic pain caused by prolonged confinement,
malnutrition from irregular and inadequate feeding, and various health problems that went untreated. The psychological effects were even more severe, including symptoms of what would later be recognized as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Cameron's treatment of Colleen evolved over time, becoming in some ways more subtle, but no less controlling. As his confidence in her psychological subjugation grew, he relied less on physical restraints and more on the psychological chains he had forged. Colleen had been so thoroughly conditioned to obey that she no longer required constant supervision to remain compliant. The relationship between Cameron and Janice began to deteriorate as the years passed, and the stress of maintaining their secret began to take its toll. Janice became increasingly uncomfortable with the situation and began to question Cameron's explanations for why Colleen had to be kept as a prisoner. She started to see through some of Cameron's lies and to recognize that the company was a fiction created to justify his abuse. Janice's growing discomfort with the situation was complicated by her own psychological dependence on Cameron and her fear of what he might do if she challenged him directly. She had been isolated from friends and family, financially dependent on Cameron, and subjected to his controlling behavior for years. Her situation was similar to Colleen's in many ways, though she retained more physical freedom and was not subjected to the same level of systematic torture. The beginning of the end for Colleen's captivity came when Janice began to research the legal and psychological concepts that Cameron had used to justify his actions. She discovered that the company did not exist, that the documents Cameron had shown her were fabricated, and that the entire elaborate structure of lies was Cameron's creation. This realization began to undermine the psychological control that Cameron had exercised over both women. Janice's decision to help Colleen escape was not sudden but evolved over time as she gained understanding of the true nature of what had been happening in her home. She began to see Colleen not as Cameron's property or as a willing participant in bizarre games, but as a victim of systematic abuse who deserved freedom and justice. This shift in perspective required enormous courage given the risks involved in challenging Cameron. The process of revealing the truth to Colleen was delicate and dangerous. Janice had to carefully explain that the company was fictional, that Colleen's family was not in danger, and that escape was possible without putting anyone at risk. This required undoing years of psychological conditioning and helping Colleen reconnect with her own agency and decision-making capabilities. Colleen's initial reaction to learning that the company was fictional was not relief but terror. The entire structure of beliefs that had allowed her to survive her captivity was suddenly revealed to be false, but the psychological conditioning remained powerful. She had to overcome not only her fear of Cameron, but also the cognitive patterns that had kept her alive during years of abuse. The decision to escape required Colleen to fundamentally reconceptualize her reality and her place in the world. She had to reconnect with her pre-captivity identity, remember that she had rights and options, and find the courage to take action despite years of conditioning that had taught her that resistance was futile and dangerous. When Colleen finally left the Hooker house in 1984, it was not a dramatic escape but a quiet departure facilitated by Janice's courage and assistance. After 7 years of captivity, Colleen simply walked away from the situation that had defined her entire adult life. The transition from captivity to freedom was not instantaneous relief, but the beginning of another difficult journey toward recovery and justice. The legal proceedings that followed Colleen's escape were complex and challenging. The physical evidence of her captivity was limited, and much of the case depended on testimony from Colleen and Janice about events that had occurred over many years. Cameron's defense team attempted to portray the situation as consensual role-playing rather than kidnapping and torture, a strategy that required re-victimizing Colleen through the legal process. The trial revealed the full scope of Cameron's psychological manipulation and the elaborate systems he had created to maintain control over both women. Expert witnesses testified about the psychological dynamics of captivity, the reality of learned helplessness, and the ways that systematic abuse could create the conditions that made escape seem impossible even when opportunities were available. Colleen's testimony was crucial to securing Cameron's conviction, but providing it required her to relive traumatic experiences in a public forum while facing aggressive cross-examination designed to undermine her credibility. The legal system's adversarial nature was poorly suited to handling cases involving complex psychological manipulation and long-term captivity. Cameron Hooker was ultimately convicted of kidnapping and sentenced to 104 years in prison, ensuring that he would never again have the opportunity to harm another person in the way he had harmed Colleen. The sentence reflected both the severity of his crimes and the recognition that his actions represented a level of sustained cruelty that warranted the harshest possible punishment. The aftermath of the trial was not the end of Colleen's ordeal but the beginning of a long process of recovery and rebuilding. She had to learn how to live as a free person after years of captivity, how to make decisions for herself, how to form relationships based on equality rather than control, and how to process the trauma of her experiences. The psychological impact of 7 years of systematic abuse could not be quickly or easily overcome. Colleen struggled with anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress symptoms that affected every aspect of her life. She had to relearn basic social skills, rebuild her sense of self-worth, and find ways to trust other people despite her experiences. The case of Colleen Stan became a landmark in the study of psychological manipulation, captivity, and survival. Researchers and clinicians studied her experiences to better understand how human beings adapt to extreme circumstances, and how systematic abuse affects the mind and spirit. Her case contributed to improved understanding of Stockholm Syndrome, learned helplessness, and complex trauma. The media attention surrounding the case was both helpful and harmful. While it brought awareness to issues of psychological manipulation and long-term captivity, it also subjected Colleen to continued scrutiny and forced her to repeatedly relive her experiences for public consumption. The balance between public education and individual privacy remained a constant challenge. Colleen's story became a powerful example of human resilience and the capacity for survival under impossible circumstances. Her ability to maintain her core identity through years of systematic abuse, to eventually recognize the possibility of freedom, and to rebuild her life after captivity, inspired others who had experienced trauma and demonstrated the remarkable strength of the human spirit. The case also highlighted important questions about the nature of consent, the power of psychological manipulation, and the responsibility of society to protect vulnerable individuals from predators who exploit human psychology for their own gratification. Cameron Hooker's ability to maintain complete control over another human being for 7 years revealed the sophisticated understanding of human psychology that some criminals possess. The role of Janice Hooker in both enabling and ultimately ending Colleen's captivity raised complex questions about complicity, victimization, and moral responsibility. Her evolution from reluctant participant to courageous ally demonstrated the possibility of breaking free from cycles of abuse and taking action to help others, even at significant personal risk. The legal and social system's response to Colleen's case revealed both strengths and weaknesses in how society handles crimes involving psychological manipulation and long-term captivity. While justice was ultimately served, the process was difficult and sometimes re-traumatizing for the victim, highlighting the need for more sophisticated approaches to such cases. Years after her escape, Colleen Stan continues to be an advocate for survivors of long-term captivity and psychological abuse. Her willingness to share her experiences despite the personal cost has helped educate law enforcement, mental health professionals, and the general public about the realities of systematic psychological manipulation. The case remains relevant today as understanding of psychological abuse, human trafficking, and coercive control continues to evolve.
Colleen's experiences provide insights into how predators operate, how victims adapt to impossible circumstances, and how recovery is possible even after the most severe trauma. The story of the girl in the box serves as both a testament to human resilience and a warning about the capacity for evil that exists within seemingly ordinary people. It reminds us that predators often hide behind facades of normalcy, and that victims of psychological manipulation may not be able to simply leave their situations even when opportunities appear to exist. Colleen Stan's survival and eventual escape represent a victory not just for her personally, but for the principle that human dignity and freedom cannot be permanently destroyed, no matter how systematic and sustained the efforts to do so. Her story continues to inspire and educate, ensuring that her suffering was not meaningless, and that others may be helped by understanding what she endured and overcame. The legacy of Colleen Stan's case extends beyond the individual tragedy to broader questions about human nature, the psychology of control, and the responsibility of society to protect its most vulnerable members. Her story challenges us to remain vigilant against the subtle forms of manipulation and control that can escalate into devastating abuse, and to never underestimate the human capacity for both cruelty and resilience. What happens when a moment of trust becomes 7 years of unthinkable horror? When a simple decision to accept help from strangers transforms into the longest psychological experiment in human endurance ever documented? The case of Colleen Stan challenges everything we think we know about survival, the human mind's capacity to adapt to impossible circumstances, and the terrifying power of psychological manipulation. This is not just a story about kidnapping. This is a story about how the human spirit can be both broken and preserved, how evil can masquerade as normalcy, and how one woman's incredible resilience ultimately triumphed over systematic brutality. On May 19, 1977, 20-year-old Colleen Stan was hitchhiking from Eugene, Oregon, to Westwood, California, to attend a friend's birthday party. She was young, optimistic, and trusting in the way that many people were before the world became more cautious about accepting rides from strangers. Colleen had hitchhiked before without incident. It was a common practice in the 1970s, a time when people were more willing to help each other and less aware of the dangers that lurked behind friendly faces. Colleen had already declined several rides that day, following her personal rule of never getting into vehicles with single men. When a blue Dodge Colt pulled over containing a man, a woman, and a baby, she felt safe enough to accept their offer of a ride. The couple seemed normal, even wholesome. The woman, who introduced herself as Janice, was friendly and talkative. The man, Cameron, was quieter but appeared harmless. The presence of the baby reinforced Colleen's sense that these were simply good people offering help to a fellow traveler. Cameron Hooker was 30 years old, married to 19-year-old Janice, and they had an infant daughter together. To all external appearances, they were an ordinary young family. Cameron worked construction jobs, Janice was a homemaker, and they lived in a modest mobile home in Red Bluff, California. Their neighbors saw them as quiet, unremarkable people who kept to themselves. But behind this facade of normalcy, Cameron harbored dark fantasies that he had been nurturing for years. The ride began normally enough. The couple chatted with Colleen about her destination and her plans. They seemed genuinely interested in helping her reach her friend's party. But as they drove further from populated areas, the atmosphere in the car began to change. Cameron became more controlling of the conversation, and Janice grew noticeably quieter and more tense. Colleen sensed something was wrong but was trapped in a moving vehicle with nowhere to go. When Cameron suddenly pulled over on a remote stretch of highway, claiming the car was overheating, Colleen's instincts screamed danger. As she prepared to get out of the car, Cameron produced a knife and ordered her to comply with his instructions. In that moment, Colleen's life changed forever. She was no longer a free young woman traveling to see friends. She had become the prisoner of a man whose twisted psychology would torture her for the next 7 years. Cameron forced Colleen to put her head down and placed a wooden box over her head. The box was crudely constructed but effective in its purpose of sensory deprivation and psychological intimidation. Colleen was completely disoriented, unable to see where they were going or what was happening around her. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. She was stripped of her ability to orient herself in space and time, making her completely dependent on her captors. The drive to the Hooker residence took several hours, during which Colleen remained trapped under the box, struggling to breathe and fighting panic. Cameron used this time to begin the psychological conditioning that would characterize her entire captivity. He established rules that she would be expected to follow without question, threatened severe punishment for any disobedience, and began the process of breaking down her sense of self and autonomy. When they arrived at the Hooker property, Colleen was taken to what would become her prison for the next 7 years. Cameron had constructed a wooden box measuring approximately 3 feet by 7 feet by 3 feet, small enough that she could not stand up or fully stretch out. This box was placed under the couple's bed, literally beneath the foundation of their family life. The symbolism was as cruel as it was practical. Colleen was relegated to existing below the level of human consideration. The initial period of captivity was designed to establish total control over every aspect of Colleen's existence. She was stripped of her clothes, her identity, and her connection to the outside world. Cameron subjected her to various forms of physical torture, including electrical shocks delivered through devices he had constructed specifically for this purpose. The pain was severe enough to be unbearable, but carefully calibrated to avoid causing permanent physical damage that might kill her. The psychological torture was even more systematic and devastating than the physical abuse. Cameron created an elaborate fiction about an organization called The Company that he claimed controlled his actions and had extensive reach throughout the country. According to this fabricated narrative, the company was a secret organization that specialized in capturing and training individuals to serve as personal property for wealthy clients. Cameron told Colleen that the company had extensive files on her family and friends, and that any attempt to escape or seek help would result in their deaths. He claimed that the organization had operatives everywhere, including within law enforcement agencies, making it impossible for her to find help even if she managed to escape. This fictional narrative served multiple psychological purposes, explaining why she was being held while simultaneously eliminating any hope of rescue or escape. The story of the company was supported by elaborate documentation that Cameron created to make his lies more convincing. He showed Colleen contracts that allegedly bound her to serve the company, rules that governed her behavior, and correspondence that supposedly came from higher-ranking members of the organization. These documents were carefully crafted to appear authentic and to reinforce the hopelessness of her situation. Cameron's psychological manipulation extended beyond the creation of fictional organizations. He systematically worked to break down Colleen's sense of self and replace it with complete dependence on him. He controlled every aspect of her daily existence, from when she could eat to when she could use the bathroom. He determined what she could wear, what she could say, and how she could move. This total control over basic human needs created a psychological state known as learned helplessness. The concept of learned helplessness, first identified in laboratory experiments with animals, describes how creatures subjected to inescapable harmful situations eventually stop trying to escape even when opportunities for freedom become available. In Colleen's case, the systematic removal of all autonomy and the constant threat of severe punishment for any violation of rules created a psychological state where resistance seemed not only futile but dangerous. Colleen spent most of her time confined in the box under the bed, emerging only when Cameron decided to let her out for specific purposes. These periods outside the box were not relief from her torment but different forms of abuse. She was subjected to various forms of physical torture, forced to participate in Cameron's twisted fantasies, and required to perform household tasks while remaining completely subservient. The box itself became both a physical and psychological prison. The space was so cramped that Colleen could not stand, could barely sit up, and had to remain in uncomfortable positions for hours at a time.
The isolation was complete. She could hear the family going about their daily lives above her but was completely cut off from human contact, except when Cameron chose to interact with her. The sensory deprivation was severe, with no light, limited air circulation, and only the sounds of footsteps and muffled voices to indicate that the outside world still existed. The physical effects of prolonged confinement were severe and cumulative. Colleen's muscles atrophied from lack of use. Her joints became stiff and painful from being held in cramped positions. Her skin became pale and unhealthy from lack of sunlight and proper hygiene. The psychological effects were even more profound, as her sense of time became distorted and her connection to her pre-captivity identity began to fade. Cameron's control over Colleen extended to manipulating her understanding of time and reality. She was often kept in the box for days at a time with no indication of whether it was day or night, what day of the week it was, or how much time had passed. This temporal disorientation was a deliberate tactic designed to further break down her psychological defenses and make her more dependent on Cameron for basic information about the world. Janice Hooker's role in Colleen's captivity was complex and evolved over time. Initially, she appeared to be simply following her husband's instructions, perhaps out of fear or coercion. However, as the years passed, it became clear that she was an active participant in maintaining Colleen's imprisonment. She helped care for Colleen when necessary, assisted in moving her between different locations within the house, and participated in the elaborate deceptions that kept Colleen psychologically enslaved. The relationship between Cameron and Janice was itself dysfunctional and abusive. Cameron exercised the same controlling behavior over his wife that he used on Colleen, though to a lesser degree. Janice lived in fear of her husband's temper and his increasingly bizarre demands. She was isolated from friends and family, financially dependent on Cameron, and psychologically manipulated through many of the same techniques he used on Colleen. As the months turned into years, Colleen's captivity settled into a horrific routine. She would spend the majority of her time in the box, emerging only when Cameron decided she was needed for household tasks or when he wanted to subject her to various forms of abuse. The predictability of the routine created a strange form of stability that her mind desperately clung to as a way of maintaining some sense of order in chaos. The psychological adaptation that allowed Colleen to survive her ordeal was both remarkable and heartbreaking. Her mind found ways to cope with unimaginable circumstances by compartmentalizing experiences, creating internal worlds where she could retreat during the worst moments, and developing an almost superhuman ability to endure physical and emotional pain. These coping mechanisms were essential for her survival but came at an enormous psychological cost. Cameron's treatment of Colleen was not consistently brutal. He occasionally showed her small kindnesses or allowed her minor privileges, creating a psychological dynamic known as intermittent reinforcement. This pattern of unpredictable rewards and punishments is one of the most powerful forms of behavioral conditioning, creating strong emotional bonds between captor and victim, even in situations of extreme abuse. The most psychologically devastating aspect of Colleen's captivity may have been the way Cameron systematically destroyed her connections to her previous life and identity. He forced her to write letters to her family explaining that she was fine and had chosen to disappear. These letters, dictated by Cameron but written in Colleen's hand, served to prevent search efforts and to make Colleen complicit in her own disappearance. The letters to her family were particularly cruel because they used Colleen's own words to lie to the people who loved her most. Cameron carefully crafted messages that would sound like Colleen's voice while explaining away her absence in ways that would discourage further contact. The psychological impact on Colleen of being forced to deceive her family was devastating, creating additional guilt and shame that further isolated her from any hope of rescue. In 1981, after 4 years of captivity, Cameron made a decision that demonstrated both his confidence in his psychological control over Colleen and his own twisted sense of power. He allowed her to visit her family, presenting this as a privilege granted by the company for her good behavior. The visit was presented as a test of her loyalty and obedience, with the understanding that any attempt to reveal her situation would result in death for both her and her family. The visit to her family was perhaps the most psychologically complex period of Colleen's entire ordeal. After years of imprisonment and systematic psychological manipulation, she found herself in the presence of people who loved her and wanted to help her, yet she was unable to ask for that help. The conditioning she had undergone was so complete that even when presented with obvious opportunities for escape, she could not take advantage of them. Colleen's family noticed that she seemed different, quieter, more withdrawn, and strangely deferential, but they attributed these changes to natural maturation and life experiences. They were overjoyed to see her and wanted to support her in whatever way they could, but they had no idea that she was being held captive and tortured. The cognitive dissonance between her family's love and acceptance and her own internal reality must have been overwhelming. During the visit, Colleen was in constant contact with Cameron, who monitored her activities and reminded her of the consequences of betraying the company. She was required to call him regularly, report on her activities, and follow specific instructions about what she could and could not do. Even in the presence of her family, she remained psychologically imprisoned by Cameron's threats and conditioning. The decision to return to captivity after the family visit demonstrates the profound psychological control that Cameron had established over Colleen. Despite being physically free and surrounded by people who would have helped her, she voluntarily returned to a situation that she knew would involve continued torture and imprisonment. This choice was not rational in any conventional sense, but was the result of years of systematic psychological manipulation. Cameron's confidence in his control over Colleen was so complete that he began to allow her more freedom of movement within the house, and even outside. She was permitted to work in the garden, help with household tasks, and occasionally interact with neighbors. To outside observers, she appeared to be a quiet, submissive woman, who was perhaps a bit odd, but not obviously in distress. The normalization of Colleen's presence in the Hooker household was another form of psychological torture. She was forced to participate in the facade of normal family life, while remaining a prisoner. She helped care for Cameron and Janice's children, participated in household routines, and even attended some social functions, all while knowing that any deviation from Cameron's expectations would result in severe punishment. The years of captivity took an enormous toll on Colleen's physical and mental health. She suffered from chronic pain caused by prolonged confinement, malnutrition from irregular and inadequate feeding, and various health problems that went untreated. The psychological effects were even more severe, including symptoms of what would later be recognized as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Cameron's treatment of Colleen evolved over time, becoming in some ways more subtle, but no less controlling. As his confidence in her psychological subjugation grew, he relied less on physical restraints and more on the psychological chains he had forged. Colleen had been so thoroughly conditioned to obey that she no longer required constant supervision to remain compliant. The relationship between Cameron and Janice began to deteriorate as the years passed, and the stress of maintaining their secret began to take its toll. Janice became increasingly uncomfortable with the situation and began to question Cameron's explanations for why Colleen had to be kept as a prisoner. She started to see through some of Cameron's lies and to recognize that the company was a fiction created to justify his abuse. Janice's growing discomfort with the situation was complicated by her own psychological dependence on Cameron and her fear of what he might do if she challenged him directly. She had been isolated from friends and family, financially dependent on Cameron, and subjected to his controlling behavior for years. Her situation was similar to Colleen's in many ways, though she retained more physical freedom and was not subjected to the same level of systematic torture. The beginning of the end for Colleen's captivity came when Janice began to research the legal and psychological concepts that Cameron had used to justify his actions. She discovered that the company did not exist, that the documents Cameron had shown her were fabricated, and that the entire elaborate structure of lies was Cameron's creation. This realization began to undermine the psychological control that Cameron had exercised over both women. Janice's decision to help Colleen escape was not sudden but evolved over time as she gained understanding of the true nature of what had been happening in her home. She began to see Colleen not as Cameron's property or as a willing participant in bizarre games, but as a victim of systematic abuse who deserved freedom and justice. This shift in perspective required enormous courage given the risks involved in challenging Cameron. The process of revealing the truth to Colleen was delicate and dangerous. Janice had to carefully explain that the company was fictional, that Colleen's family was not in danger, and that escape was possible without putting anyone at risk. This required undoing years of psychological conditioning and helping Colleen reconnect with her own agency and decision-making capabilities. Colleen's initial reaction to learning that the company was fictional was not relief but terror. The entire structure of beliefs that had allowed her to survive her captivity was suddenly revealed to be false, but the psychological conditioning remained powerful. She had to overcome not only her fear of Cameron, but also the cognitive patterns that had kept her alive during years of abuse. The decision to escape required Colleen to fundamentally reconceptualize her reality and her place in the world. She had to reconnect with her pre-captivity identity, remember that she had rights and options, and find the courage to take action despite years of conditioning that had taught her that resistance was futile and dangerous. When Colleen finally left the Hooker house in 1984, it was not a dramatic escape but a quiet departure facilitated by Janice's courage and assistance. After 7 years of captivity, Colleen simply walked away from the situation that had defined her entire adult life. The transition from captivity to freedom was not instantaneous relief, but the beginning of another difficult journey toward recovery and justice. The legal proceedings that followed Colleen's escape were complex and challenging. The physical evidence of her captivity was limited, and much of the case depended on testimony from Colleen and Janice about events that had occurred over many years. Cameron's defense team attempted to portray the situation as consensual role-playing rather than kidnapping and torture, a strategy that required re-victimizing Colleen through the legal process. The trial revealed the full scope of Cameron's psychological manipulation and the elaborate systems he had created to maintain control over both women. Expert witnesses testified about the psychological dynamics of captivity, the reality of learned helplessness, and the ways that systematic abuse could create the conditions that made escape seem impossible even when opportunities were available. Colleen's testimony was crucial to securing Cameron's conviction,
but providing it required her to relive traumatic experiences in a public forum while facing aggressive cross-examination designed to undermine her credibility. The legal system's adversarial nature was poorly suited to handling cases involving complex psychological manipulation and long-term captivity. Cameron Hooker was ultimately convicted of kidnapping and sentenced to 104 years in prison, ensuring that he would never again have the opportunity to harm another person in the way he had harmed Colleen. The sentence reflected both the severity of his crimes and the recognition that his actions represented a level of sustained cruelty that warranted the harshest possible punishment. The aftermath of the trial was not the end of Colleen's ordeal but the beginning of a long process of recovery and rebuilding. She had to learn how to live as a free person after years of captivity, how to make decisions for herself, how to form relationships based on equality rather than control, and how to process the trauma of her experiences. The psychological impact of 7 years of systematic abuse could not be quickly or easily overcome. Colleen struggled with anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress symptoms that affected every aspect of her life. She had to relearn basic social skills, rebuild her sense of self-worth, and find ways to trust other people despite her experiences. The case of Colleen Stan became a landmark in the study of psychological manipulation, captivity, and survival. Researchers and clinicians studied her experiences to better understand how human beings adapt to extreme circumstances, and how systematic abuse affects the mind and spirit. Her case contributed to improved understanding of Stockholm Syndrome, learned helplessness, and complex trauma. The media attention surrounding the case was both helpful and harmful. While it brought awareness to issues of psychological manipulation and long-term captivity, it also subjected Colleen to continued scrutiny and forced her to repeatedly relive her experiences for public consumption. The balance between public education and individual privacy remained a constant challenge. Colleen's story became a powerful example of human resilience and the capacity for survival under impossible circumstances. Her ability to maintain her core identity through years of systematic abuse, to eventually recognize the possibility of freedom, and to rebuild her life after captivity, inspired others who had experienced trauma and demonstrated the remarkable strength of the human spirit. The case also highlighted important questions about the nature of consent, the power of psychological manipulation, and the responsibility of society to protect vulnerable individuals from predators who exploit human psychology for their own gratification. Cameron Hooker's ability to maintain complete control over another human being for 7 years revealed the sophisticated understanding of human psychology that some criminals possess. The role of Janice Hooker in both enabling and ultimately ending Colleen's captivity raised complex questions about complicity, victimization, and moral responsibility. Her evolution from reluctant participant to courageous ally demonstrated the possibility of breaking free from cycles of abuse and taking action to help others, even at significant personal risk. The legal and social system's response to Colleen's case revealed both strengths and weaknesses in how society handles crimes involving psychological manipulation and long-term captivity. While justice was ultimately served, the process was difficult and sometimes re-traumatizing for the victim, highlighting the need for more sophisticated approaches to such cases. Years after her escape, Colleen Stan continues to be an advocate for survivors of long-term captivity and psychological abuse. Her willingness to share her experiences despite the personal cost has helped educate law enforcement, mental health professionals, and the general public about the realities of systematic psychological manipulation. The case remains relevant today as understanding of psychological abuse, human trafficking, and coercive control continues to evolve.
Colleen's experiences provide insights into how predators operate, how victims adapt to impossible circumstances, and how recovery is possible even after the most severe trauma. The story of the girl in the box serves as both a testament to human resilience and a warning about the capacity for evil that exists within seemingly ordinary people. It reminds us that predators often hide behind facades of normalcy, and that victims of psychological manipulation may not be able to simply leave their situations even when opportunities appear to exist. Colleen Stan's survival and eventual escape represent a victory not just for her personally, but for the principle that human dignity and freedom cannot be permanently destroyed, no matter how systematic and sustained the efforts to do so. Her story continues to inspire and educate, ensuring that her suffering was not meaningless, and that others may be helped by understanding what she endured and overcame. The legacy of Colleen Stan's case extends beyond the individual tragedy to broader questions about human nature, the psychology of control, and the responsibility of society to protect its most vulnerable members. Her story challenges us to remain vigilant against the subtle forms of manipulation and control that can escalate into devastating abuse, and to never underestimate the human capacity for both cruelty and resilience. The final statement. Bud Dwyer's tragic end and America's reckoning with live television. What happens when a man's final act of desperation becomes a defining moment in broadcast history? When personal tragedy intersects with public accountability in the most shocking way possible, the suicide of Pennsylvania State Treasurer Robert "Bud" Dwyer on January 22, 1987, during a live televised press conference, remains one of the most disturbing and controversial moments ever captured on camera. This is not just a story about political corruption or personal despair. This is a story about the power of live television, the complex relationship between public service and private anguish, and how one man's final moments forced an entire nation to confront difficult questions about media responsibility, human dignity, and the price of public accountability. Robert "Bud" Dwyer was born in 1939 in St. Charles, Missouri, but spent most of his life in Pennsylvania, where he would build a career in public service that spanned over 2 decades. He was known to friends and colleagues as Bud, a nickname that reflected his approachable, down-to-earth personality. Dwyer was a family man, married to his wife Joanne since with whom he had 2 children. He represented what many Americans considered the ideal of public service, a dedicated civil servant who had worked his way up through the ranks of government to serve the people of Pennsylvania. Dwyer's political career began in the 1960s when he served as a social studies teacher and later moved into local politics. He was elected to the Pennsylvania House of Representatives in 1970, where he served for several terms before being elected to the Pennsylvania Senate in 19. His colleagues remembered him as hardworking, honest, and genuinely committed to serving his constituents. In 1980, he was elected as Pennsylvania State Treasurer, a position that carried significant responsibility for managing the state's finances and overseeing various financial programs. As state treasurer, Dwyer was responsible for managing billions of dollars in state funds, overseeing the state's investment portfolio, and ensuring the financial integrity of Pennsylvania's government operations. It was a position that required not only financial expertise but also unquestioned integrity, as the treasurer had access to enormous sums of public money and the power to make decisions that could significantly impact the state's financial health. The scandal that would ultimately destroy Dwyer's career and life began with a contract awarded by the state for recovering delinquent taxes. The contract was awarded to Computer Technology Associates, a California-based company, in a deal worth millions of dollars. What should have been a routine government contract became the center of a major corruption investigation when questions arose about how the contract was awarded and whether improper payments had influenced the selection process. The investigation revealed a complex web of alleged kickbacks, bribes, and political corruption that reached into the highest levels of Pennsylvania government. Several individuals were accused of receiving payments in exchange for their influence in awarding the contract, and prosecutors built a case that they claimed showed systematic corruption in the state's procurement process. The investigation lasted for years and involved numerous witnesses, financial records, and allegations of improper conduct. Dwyer became a central figure in the investigation when prosecutors alleged that he had accepted a bribe in exchange for his influence in awarding the contract. The specific allegation was that he had received a payment of $300,000 from individuals connected to Computer Technology Associates in return for his support of their bid for the contract. Prosecutors claimed they had evidence of the payment and that Dwyer had used his position as state treasurer to influence the contract award process. Throughout the investigation, Dwyer maintained his complete innocence. He denied ever receiving any improper payments and insisted that he had played no role in any corruption scheme. His defense was that he had been targeted by prosecutors who were looking for high-profile convictions and that the evidence against him was fabricated or misinterpreted. Dwyer's supporters pointed to his long record of public service and his reputation for integrity as evidence that the charges were unfounded. The legal proceedings against Dwyer were lengthy and complex, involving multiple defendants and numerous charges related to the alleged corruption scheme. The case received significant media attention in Pennsylvania, both because of the amounts of money involved and because it implicated several high-ranking state officials. For Dwyer, who had spent his career building a reputation as an honest public servant, the charges represented not just a legal challenge but a fundamental attack on his character and integrity. The trial began in late 1986 and lasted for several weeks. Prosecutors presented evidence that they claimed showed Dwyer had received bribes and had used his position to influence the contract award. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that Dwyer was being scapegoated by prosecutors who were under pressure to secure convictions in a high-profile case. The trial featured testimony from numerous witnesses, including individuals who had been involved in the contract award process, and others who claimed to have knowledge of the alleged corruption scheme. On December 18, 1986, after deliberating for several days, the jury returned guilty verdicts against Dwyer on 11 counts, including conspiracy, mail fraud, perjury, and interstate transportation in aid of racketeering. The convictions carried the possibility of a lengthy prison sentence, and Dwyer faced the prospect of spending many years in federal prison. For a man who had devoted his life to public
public service and had maintained his innocence throughout the proceedings, the guilty verdicts were devastating. The conviction also had immediate practical consequences for Dwyer's position as state treasurer. Under Pennsylvania law, his conviction made him ineligible to continue serving in office, and he faced the prospect of being removed from his position before his term expired. This meant that in addition to facing prison time, he would lose his livelihood and his ability to continue serving the public in the capacity that had defined his adult life. Following his conviction, Dwyer's legal team filed appeals and motions challenging the verdicts. They argued that the evidence was insufficient to support the convictions and that their client had been the victim of prosecutorial misconduct. However, the appeals process would take time, and Dwyer was scheduled to be sentenced on January 23, 1987, just one day after what would become his final press conference. The period between his conviction and scheduled sentencing was extremely difficult for Dwyer and his family. In addition to the stress of facing prison time, they had to cope with the public humiliation of the conviction and the constant media attention that surrounded the case. Dwyer's wife and children found themselves thrust into the spotlight in the most painful way possible, as their husband and father's reputation was destroyed, and his future appeared hopeless. On January 21, 1987, Dwyer's office announced that he would hold a press conference the following morning to make a statement about his situation. The announcement was routine, and local media outlets prepared to cover what they expected would be either a resignation statement or some form of final comment on his conviction and impending sentencing. Press conferences by public officials facing legal troubles were common, and reporters expected to hear Dwyer's final thoughts on his case. The press conference was scheduled for 10:30 a.m. on January 22, 1987, in the Pennsylvania State Capitol building in Harrisburg. Local television stations planned to carry the event live, as was standard practice for significant announcements by state officials. The room was filled with reporters, camera operators, and photographers who expected to witness and record what would likely be Dwyer's final official act as state treasurer. When Dwyer entered the room, he appeared composed but visibly stressed. He was accompanied by aides and carried a manila envelope that contained the statement he planned to read. The atmosphere was somber, as everyone present understood the gravity of the situation and the likelihood that they were witnessing the end of a political career that had spanned more than 2 decades. Dwyer began by reading a lengthy prepared statement that addressed his conviction, his continued claims of innocence, and his thoughts on the legal proceedings that had led to his downfall. The statement was detailed and emotional, reflecting his frustration with what he saw as an unjust legal system and his despair over the destruction of his reputation and career. He spoke about his love for his family, his commitment to public service, and his belief that he had been wrongly convicted. The statement lasted for approximately 20 minutes, during which Dwyer covered various aspects of his case and his feelings about his situation. He maintained his innocence throughout, insisting that he had never accepted bribes or engaged in any corrupt activities. He also expressed his frustration with the legal system and his belief that he had been treated unfairly by prosecutors and the courts. As Dwyer neared the end of his prepared statement, he began to discuss his options going forward and his thoughts about his future. It was at this point that the tone of his remarks became more ominous, though few in the audience immediately recognized the significance of his words. He spoke about his desire to spare his family further humiliation and his belief that his continued fight against the charges would only prolong their suffering. Then, as he concluded his statement, Dwyer made a remark that would prove to be a final warning to those present. He said something to the effect that some people might find what he was about to do disturbing, and he suggested that anyone who might be upset should leave the room. The comment was puzzling to many in the audience, who weren't sure what he meant or why he was giving such a warning. What happened next shocked everyone present and created one of the most disturbing moments in the history of live television. Dwyer reached into the manila envelope he had been carrying and withdrew a .357 Magnum revolver. The sight of the weapon caused immediate panic in the room, as reporters and camera operators realized that something terrible was about to happen. Several people in the room, including some of his aides, attempted to intervene and stop Dwyer from whatever he was planning to do. Voices could be heard shouting "No" and "Don't do it" as people rushed toward him. However, Dwyer was determined to carry out his plan, and he held the gun in a way that prevented others from easily reaching him or disarming him. Despite the desperate attempts by others to stop him, Dwyer placed the barrel of the revolver in his mouth and pulled the trigger. The gunshot was captured live on television, creating one of the most shocking moments in broadcast history. The sound of the gunshot and the immediate aftermath were recorded by multiple cameras and broadcast live to viewers across Pennsylvania and beyond. The immediate aftermath of the shooting was chaotic and traumatic for everyone present. Emergency medical personnel were called to the scene, but it was immediately clear that the wound was fatal, and that there was nothing that could be done to save Dwyer's life. The press conference room was transformed from a site of routine political news into a crime scene, with law enforcement officers arriving to secure the area and begin their investigation. The reporters and camera operators who had witnessed the suicide were left to deal with the immediate shock and trauma of having seen someone take their own life in front of them. Many had covered tragic events throughout their careers, but few had experienced the horror of watching someone deliberately end their life during what was supposed to be a routine assignment. The footage of the suicide was broadcast live on several local television stations, meaning that viewers across Pennsylvania and potentially beyond witnessed Dwyer's death as it happened. The live broadcast of such a graphic and disturbing event raised immediate questions about the responsibilities of television stations and the appropriateness of showing such content to viewers who were not prepared for what they were about to see. The decision about what to do with the footage created unprecedented ethical dilemmas for news organizations. Some stations continued to broadcast the footage, treating it as a significant news event that the public had a right to see. Others immediately cut away from the scene or switched to other programming, recognizing that the graphic nature of the content was inappropriate for general audiences. The footage was also recorded and preserved, creating a permanent record of Dwyer's final moments. This raised questions about how such sensitive material should be handled, stored, and potentially used in future news reports or historical documentation. The existence of the footage meant that Dwyer's death would be available for viewing indefinitely, creating ongoing ethical concerns about the dignity of the deceased and the impact on his family. In the hours and days following the suicide, television stations and news organizations faced difficult decisions about how to report on the event and whether to continue showing the footage. Many stations chose to show portions of the press conference leading up to the suicide, but stopped before the actual shooting, while others showed the complete footage as part of their news coverage. The circulation of the footage beyond traditional news media became a significant concern, as copies of the recording began to spread through other channels. In the pre-internet era, this meant that copies were shared through informal networks, but the graphic nature of the content and the public interest in the story ensured that the footage would continue to circulate widely. The investigation into Dwyer's death was relatively straightforward from a legal perspective, as the suicide had occurred in front of multiple witnesses and had been recorded on camera. However, the investigation into the circumstances surrounding his decision to take his own life was more complex and involved examining his mental state, his financial situation, and his prospects for appeal. The suicide had immediate implications for the legal proceedings related to Dwyer's conviction. With the defendant dead, the appeals process became moot, and questions arose about whether his conviction would stand or be vacated. The legal system had to grapple with how to handle a case where the convicted individual had died by suicide before exhausting all appeals options. The impact on Dwyer's family was devastating and complex. In addition to grieving the loss of their husband and father, they had to cope with the very public nature of his death and the ongoing questions about his guilt or innocence. The family faced the difficult task of mourning their loss while also dealing with the legal and financial implications of his conviction and death. The family's situation was complicated by questions about Dwyer's pension and benefits, which were affected by his conviction. They also had to deal with the ongoing media attention and public speculation about Dwyer's guilt or innocence, which made their grieving process even more difficult. The aftermath of the suicide also raised questions about the original charges against Dwyer and whether his death suggested guilt or innocence. Some argued that his suicide was evidence of guilt and an inability to face the consequences of his actions. Others contended that an innocent man had been driven to desperation by an unjust legal system, and that his death was a tragedy that could have been prevented. The case contributed to broader discussions about the pressures faced by public officials and the potential for the legal system to drive individuals to desperate acts. Mental health professionals noted that the combination of public humiliation, financial ruin, and the prospect of imprisonment could create psychological pressures that some individuals might find unbearable. The media coverage of Dwyer's death and the ethical questions it raised became subjects of intense debate within journalism and broadcasting. Professional organizations and academic institutions used the case as an example of the ethical dilemmas that journalists and broadcasters face when covering tragic events, particularly when they unfold in real time. The case also highlighted the power and responsibility of live television broadcasting. The ability to transmit events as they happen created new possibilities for news coverage but also new risks and responsibilities. The Dwyer case demonstrated how quickly a routine news event could become a traumatic experience for viewers and raised questions about the appropriate limits of live broadcasting. Educational institutions that train journalists and broadcasters began using the Dwyer case as a teaching tool for discussing media ethics, suicide reporting, and the responsibilities of news organizations. The case provided a concrete example of how editorial decisions about what to show and how to present it could have profound consequences for viewers, families, and society as a whole. The footage of Dwyer's suicide became a reference point in discussions about censorship, media responsibility, and the balance between public interest and human dignity. The graphic nature of the content and its availability for viewing raised questions about what should be considered appropriate for broadcast, and what standards should govern the distribution of such material. Over time, the Dwyer case influenced the development of guidelines and policies for handling similar situations in the future. News organizations developed protocols for covering suicides, particularly those involving public figures, with greater attention to the potential impact on viewers and the families of those involved.
The case also contributed to broader discussions about suicide prevention and the warning signs that might indicate when someone is considering taking their own life. Mental health professionals studied Dwyer's behavior and statements leading up to his death to better understand how to identify and intervene with individuals who might be at risk. The legacy of Bud Dwyer's death extends beyond the immediate circumstances of his case to broader questions about justice, media responsibility, and the human cost of public accountability. His death serves as a reminder that behind every public scandal and legal proceeding are real human beings with families, feelings, and vulnerabilities that must be considered even as society seeks accountability from its public servants. The case remains relevant today as society continues to grapple with questions about media coverage of suicide, the responsibilities of news organizations, and the balance between public interest and human dignity. In an era of social media and instant communication, the ethical questions raised by the Dwyer case have become even more complex and urgent. The preserved footage and documentation of the case serve as historical records that researchers and practitioners can study to better understand the dynamics involved in public scandals and their human consequences. While the tragic nature of the event makes it difficult to discuss, the lessons it provides about media responsibility, mental health awareness, and the importance of support systems for public officials remain valuable. The memory of Bud Dwyer and the circumstances of his death remind us that the pursuit of justice and accountability must always be balanced with recognition of human dignity and the need for compassion. His tragic end serves as a call for greater attention to mental health, more thoughtful media coverage of public controversies, and continued efforts to create support systems that can help individuals in crisis find alternatives to despair. The case ultimately stands as a sobering reminder of the power of live television and the responsibility that comes with that power. It demonstrates how quickly a routine news event can become a tragedy, and highlights the importance of careful consideration of the ethical implications of broadcasting decisions. The lessons learned from Bud Dwyer's death continue to influence how news organizations approach similar situations, and serve as a permanent reminder of the human consequences of media coverage. Today, more than 3 decades after Dwyer's death, questions about his guilt or innocence remain unresolved. Some evidence has emerged over the years that has raised doubts about his conviction, but the legal proceedings ended with his death, leaving those questions unanswered. What remains clear is that his death was a tragedy that affected not only his family, but also everyone who witnessed it, and continues to influence discussions about media ethics, public accountability, and the treatment of individuals caught up in the justice system. The story of Bud Dwyer serves as a cautionary tale about the intersection of personal crisis and public scrutiny, the power of live media, and the importance of treating all individuals with dignity and compassion, even those who may have fallen short of the standards expected of public servants. His death remains a powerful reminder of the human cost of scandal, and the responsibility that society bears for how it treats those who serve in public office.
The day the music died, when rock and roll lost its innocence. What happens when tragedy strikes at the very moment when dreams are about to become reality? When 3 young men, each carrying the hopes and sounds of a generation, board a small plane on a cold February night and never reach their destination. The crash that killed Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and J.P. the Big Bopper Richardson on February 3, 1959, didn't just end 3 promising careers. It marked the end of rock and roll's age of innocence and became a defining moment in American cultural history. This is not just a story about a plane crash. This is a story about how a single tragic event can crystallize an entire era's hopes, dreams, and the fragility of the American dream itself. The Winter Dance Party Tour of 1959 was supposed to be a triumph. Organized by General Artists Corporation, it was a 24-day, 24-city tour featuring some of the biggest names in rock and roll. The headliners were Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and J.P. the Big Bopper Richardson, each representing different aspects of the new musical revolution that was transforming American culture. Supporting acts included Dion and the Belmonts, and Frankie Sardo, making it one of the most star-studded tours of the era. Buddy Holly was already established as one of rock and roll's most innovative artists. At just 22 years old, he had revolutionized popular music with his distinctive vocal style, pioneering use of studio techniques, and songwriting that blended country, rhythm and blues, and pop in ways that had never been heard before. Songs like That'll Be the Day, Peggy Sue, and Maybe Baby had made him a household name and established him as one of the most influential musicians of his generation. Holly's impact on rock and roll extended far beyond his hit records. He was one of the first artists to write, perform, and produce his own material, establishing a template that would influence countless musicians who followed. His use of the Fender Stratocaster guitar and innovative recording techniques helped define the sound of rock and roll. He was also one of the first rock artists to use orchestral arrangements and experiment with different musical styles within the rock format. Richie Valens, born Richard Stephen Valenzuela, was just 17 years old but had already achieved remarkable success with his fusion of rock and roll with traditional Mexican music. His hits Come On, Let's Go, Donna, and especially La Bamba, had made him the first Latino rock star and opened doors for multicultural expression in popular music. Valens represented the changing face of America and the power of rock and roll to transcend cultural boundaries. Despite his youth, Valens had demonstrated remarkable musical maturity and innovation. La Bamba, his adaptation of a traditional Mexican folk song into a rock and roll format, was groundbreaking in its fusion of cultural traditions with contemporary popular music. His success proved that rock and roll could embrace diverse cultural influences while maintaining its broad appeal to American audiences. J.P. the Big Bopper Richardson was the oldest of the three at 28, and he brought a different energy to the tour. A former disc jockey from Texas, Richardson had parlayed his radio personality into recording success with novelty songs like Chantilly Lace and Big Bopper's Wedding. His larger-than-life personality and showmanship made him a natural entertainer who could work a crowd and keep audiences engaged throughout long performances. Richardson's background in radio gave him insights into what audiences wanted to hear and how to present music in ways that would capture attention. His theatrical performance style and sense of humor made him popular with audiences who appreciated entertainment that was both musically satisfying and visually engaging. He represented the entrepreneurial spirit of early rock and roll, where artists often had to be performers, businessmen, and media personalities all at once. The Winter Dance Party Tour began on January 23, 1959, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and was scheduled to cover the upper Midwest during the coldest part of winter. The routing of the tour was problematic from the beginning, with long distances between venues and inadequate transportation arrangements. The performers were traveling in an unheated bus that frequently broke down, leaving them stranded in freezing temperatures for hours at a time. As the tour progressed, conditions became increasingly difficult. The bus heating system failed repeatedly, several performers became ill with flu and frostbite, and the demanding schedule left little time for rest or recovery. Drummer Carl Bunch was hospitalized with severe frostbite, and other musicians were struggling with illness and exhaustion. The glamorous image of rock and roll touring was quickly replaced by the harsh reality of traveling in brutal winter conditions. By the time the tour reached Clear Lake, Iowa for a February 2nd concert at the Surf Ballroom, the performers were exhausted, sick, and frustrated with the travel conditions. The bus had broken down again, and the prospect of another long, cold ride to the next venue in Moorhead, Minnesota, was increasingly unappealing. The distance to Moorhead was nearly 400 miles, which would require an all-night bus ride in freezing temperatures. Buddy Holly, as the tour's headliner, made the decision to charter a small aircraft to fly to Moorhead, which would allow the performers to arrive early, get some rest, and have time to do laundry and prepare for the next show. Holly arranged to charter a 1947 Beechcraft Bonanza from Dwyer Flying Service at the Mason City Municipal Airport, about 5 miles from Clear Lake. The decision to fly was motivated by practical concerns rather than luxury. The performers were carrying stage clothes that needed to be cleaned, and the rushed schedule of bus travel left no time for basic necessities like laundry and rest. Flying would give them a few extra hours in Moorhead to take care of these practical needs and possibly get medical attention for those who were still suffering from cold-related illnesses. Initially, Holly planned to fly with his bass player Waylon Jennings and guitarist Tommy Allsup. However, the Big Bopper, who was suffering from flu symptoms and found the bus particularly uncomfortable due to his large size, asked Jennings if he could take his seat on the plane. Jennings, perhaps feeling sorry for Richardson's obvious discomfort, agreed to give up his seat and continue with the bus. The decision about the third seat became the subject of a coin toss between Tommy Allsup and Richie Valens. Valens had never flown before and was both excited and nervous about the prospect. The coin toss was a moment of chance that would determine who lived and who died. Valens won the toss and claimed the seat on the plane, while Allsup joined Jennings on the bus. The pilot assigned to the flight was Roger Peterson, a 21-year-old who had been flying for Dwyer Flying Service. Peterson was a competent pilot under normal conditions, but lacked experience with instrument flying in poor weather conditions. He had recently failed an instrument proficiency check ride, which should have disqualified him from flying in the weather conditions that existed that night. The weather conditions on the evening of February 3rd were marginal at best for flying, especially for a pilot with limited instrument experience. Snow was falling, visibility was poor, and there were strong winds and turbulence. The flight should probably have been postponed until conditions improved, but the pressure to maintain the tour schedule and the performers' desire to escape the miserable bus travel may have influenced the decision to proceed. The Beechcraft Bonanza took off from Mason City Municipal Airport at approximately 12:55 a.m. on February 3rd. The aircraft was loaded with Holly, Valens, Richardson, and pilot Peterson, along with their luggage and instruments. The flight plan called for a relatively short trip to Fargo, North Dakota, the nearest airport to Moorhead, Minnesota, where the next concert was scheduled. Weather conditions at takeoff were deteriorating, with snow, low visibility, and gusty winds. The aircraft would need to climb through clouds and fly on instruments almost immediately after takeoff, conditions that required skills and experience that Peterson may not have possessed.
Radio contact with the aircraft was lost shortly after takeoff, and the plane disappeared into the snowy night. The aircraft crashed in a cornfield approximately 5 miles northwest of the Mason City Airport, just minutes after takeoff. The impact was devastating, killing all 4 occupants instantly. The wreckage was not discovered until the next morning, when the failure of the aircraft to arrive in Fargo prompted a search. A farmer named Albert Jewell found the wreckage scattered across his snow-covered field. The investigation into the crash, conducted by the Civil Aeronautics Board, concluded that pilot error was the primary cause of the accident. Peterson had become spatially disoriented in the poor weather conditions and had lost control of the aircraft. The investigation found that he had attempted to climb but had actually put the aircraft into a steep dive, possibly due to confusion about his instrument readings in the challenging weather conditions. The news of the crash reached the music world gradually on February 3rd, as radio stations and newspapers began reporting that 3 of rock and roll's brightest stars had been killed. The initial reports were met with disbelief, as the victims were young, successful, and seemingly invincible in the way that only rising stars can appear. The reality of their deaths took time to sink in for fans, fellow musicians, and the music industry as a whole. Buddy Holly's wife Maria Elena, who was pregnant with their first child, learned of her husband's death from television reports. The shock was so severe that she suffered a miscarriage shortly afterward, adding another layer of tragedy to an already devastating loss. She was just 25 years old, and had been married to Holly for only 6 months when she became a widow. The impact on the families of all 3 performers was profound and lasting. These were young men who had been supporting their families through their musical success, and their deaths left their loved ones not only grieving but also facing uncertain financial futures. The sudden loss of income and the end of promising careers created practical hardships that compounded the emotional devastation. The surviving members of the Winter Dance Party Tour faced the difficult decision of whether to continue with the remaining dates. After much discussion, they decided to honor their commitments and complete the tour. But the performances were somber affairs that served more as memorials than celebrations. Waylon Jennings and Tommy Allsup were haunted by the knowledge that they had narrowly escaped death through chance circumstances. Jennings in particular was troubled by his last conversation with Buddy Holly, during which he had jokingly told Holly, "I hope your plane crashes," in response to Holly's teasing about the cold bus ride. This casual remark, typical of the good-natured ribbing between friends, took on devastating significance after the crash and haunted Jennings for the rest of his life. The music industry's response to the tragedy was immediate and profound. Record companies rushed to release previously unreleased recordings by all 3 artists, creating a surge of posthumous material that kept their music in the public consciousness. Holly's recordings in particular continued to be released for years after his death, as his innovative approach to multi-tracking had left behind numerous overdub possibilities. The crash also prompted changes in how the music industry approached touring safety. The use of small charter aircraft for short hops between venues became less common, and tour organizers began paying more attention to weather conditions and pilot qualifications. The tragedy served as a wake-up call about the risks associated with the demanding schedules and travel requirements of popular music touring. The cultural impact of the day the music died extended far beyond the immediate music industry. The event became a symbol of lost innocence and the fragility of dreams in American culture. The 3 victims represented different aspects of the American experience: Holly as the innovative artist, Valens as the multicultural pioneer, and Richardson as the entrepreneurial entertainer, and their simultaneous deaths felt like the end of an era. Radio disc jockeys across the country marked the tragedy with special programming, playing the hits of all 3 artists and sharing memories of their contributions to rock and roll. These broadcasts, many of which were preserved on tape, provide a historical record of how the news was received and processed by both the music industry and the general public. The preserved radio broadcasts from February 3rd and the days that followed capture the shock and disbelief that characterized the initial response to the tragedy. Disc jockeys struggled to find words adequate to express the magnitude of the loss, and many simply let the music speak for itself, playing extended sets of the victims' recordings as a form of tribute. Don McLean's 1971 song, American Pie, immortalized the phrase, "the day the music died," and created a lasting cultural monument to the tragedy. McLean's 8.5-minute epic used the plane crash as a metaphor for the end of rock and roll's innocent era, and the beginning of more complex and troubled times in American culture. The song's cryptic lyrics invited endless interpretation and analysis, ensuring that the memory of February 3rd, 1959, would remain alive in popular consciousness. American Pie became one of the most analyzed and discussed songs in popular music history, with scholars, critics, and fans debating the meaning of its references and symbolism. While McLean has been deliberately vague about many of the song's specific meanings, he has confirmed that "the day the music died" refers specifically to the plane crash that killed Holly, Valens, and Richardson.
The song's success and cultural impact ensured that each new generation would learn about the tragedy and its significance to American music history. American Pie became a cultural touchstone that connected the tragedy to broader themes of lost innocence, cultural change, and the passage of time. McLean's masterpiece transformed a specific historical event into a universal symbol of how quickly and dramatically life can change. The influence of the three victims on subsequent musicians and musical developments cannot be overstated. Buddy Holly's innovative recording techniques and songwriting approach influenced everyone from the Beatles to Bob Dylan. His use of unconventional chord progressions, double tracking, and studio effects helped establish the template for modern rock production. The Beatles, in particular, were profoundly influenced by Holly's work. They took their name partly as a tribute to Holly's band, the Crickets, and their early recordings showed clear influences from Holly's melodic sensibilities and vocal harmonies. Paul McCartney would later purchase the rights to Holly's song catalog, demonstrating the lasting respect that Holly's work commanded among his musical descendants. Ritchie Valens' brief career established important precedents for Latino representation in rock and roll. His success with La Bamba showed that traditional ethnic music could be successfully adapted into rock formats, paving the way for later fusion movements and multicultural expressions in popular music. Artists like Santana, Los Lobos, and countless others would follow paths that Valens had pioneered. The Big Bopper's theatrical performance style and use of his radio personality in his musical career influenced the development of rock and roll as entertainment spectacle. His approach to combining music with personality and showmanship helped establish the template for rock performers who understood that success required more than just musical ability. The Mason City Municipal Airport, where the fatal flight originated, became an unlikely pilgrimage site for rock and roll fans. The Surf Ballroom in Clear Lake, where the three performers gave their final concert, was preserved as a historical landmark and continues to host concerts and memorial events. These locations serve as physical reminders of the tragedy and allow fans to connect with the history in tangible ways. Annual memorial events and tribute concerts keep the memory of the tragedy alive and celebrate the contributions of the three victims to American music. These events serve educational purposes, introducing new generations to the music and the story, while providing opportunities for fans to gather and share their appreciation for the artists' legacies. The investigation into the crash has been revisited multiple times over the decades, with some researchers questioning aspects of the official findings. Various theories have been proposed about additional factors that may have contributed to the accident, including mechanical problems with the aircraft, confusion about instrument readings, and possible medical issues affecting the pilot. However, the basic conclusion that pilot error in poor weather conditions caused the crash has remained the accepted explanation. The families of the victims have worked to preserve and promote their loved ones' legacies through various foundations, museums, and educational initiatives. These efforts ensure that the artistic contributions of Holly, Valens, and Richardson continue to be recognized and celebrated rather than being overshadowed by the tragedy of their deaths. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame has honored all three victims, recognizing their contributions to the development of popular music despite their brief careers. Holly was among the first inductees in 1986, while Valens and Richardson were inducted in 2000. These honors acknowledge their lasting influence on music history and their importance to the rock and roll tradition. Biographical films and documentaries about the three artists have helped introduce their stories to new audiences and provided deeper insights into their lives, careers, and the circumstances surrounding their deaths. The Buddy Holly Story, starring Gary Busey, brought Holly's story to mainstream attention, while La Bamba, These films, while sometimes taking liberties with historical accuracy, helped ensure that the artist's stories remained part of popular culture. The tragedy has also inspired numerous books, academic studies, and journalistic investigations that have examined various aspects of the story. These works have provided detailed analyses of the music industry conditions that led to the dangerous touring arrangements, the technical aspects of the plane crash, and the cultural significance of the event in American history. The Winter Dance Party Tour tragedy highlighted broader issues about the exploitation of young artists in the early rock and roll industry. The dangerous touring conditions, inadequate transportation, and demanding schedules that contributed to the decision to charter the fatal flight were symptomatic of an industry that prioritized profits over performer safety and well-being. Changes in the music industry following the tragedy included improved touring conditions, better transportation arrangements, and increased attention to performer safety. While these improvements came too late to help Holly, Valens, and Richardson, they may have prevented similar tragedies for other artists who followed. The legacy of February 3, 1959, extends beyond music to broader themes about youth, talent, and the unpredictability of fate. The three victims represented the dreams and aspirations of their generation, and their sudden death served as a stark reminder that success and youth provide no protection against tragedy. This theme resonated deeply with audiences who were themselves navigating the uncertainties of life in post-war America. The story of the day the music died continues to fascinate new generations because it combines elements that speak to universal human experiences, the pursuit of dreams, the fragility of life, the power of chance, and the way that art can transcend the mortality of its creators. The music of Holly, Valens, and Richardson continues to be discovered and appreciated by listeners who weren't born when the artists were alive, proving that great art can indeed achieve a form of immortality. The preserved radio broadcasts from February 3, 1959 and the days that followed provide a unique historical record of how tragic news was communicated and processed in the pre-internet era. These recordings capture the immediate shock, the gradual acceptance of the reality, and the ways that communities used music and shared memories to cope with collective loss. Modern technology has allowed for the restoration and preservation of these historical audio recordings, ensuring that future researchers and music fans will be able to hear exactly how the news was reported and received. These recordings serve as primary source material for understanding both the specific tragedy and the broader cultural context of 1950s America. The influence of the day the music died on subsequent popular culture has been enormous, extending far beyond Don McLean's famous song. References to the tragedy appear in countless other songs, books, films, and television shows, demonstrating its enduring power as a cultural symbol. The event has become shorthand for the end of innocence and the unpredictable nature of fate. Educational institutions have incorporated the story into curricula dealing with American history, music history, and cultural studies. The tragedy provides a concrete example of how popular culture both reflects and shapes broader social experiences, making it valuable for students trying to understand the relationship between art and society. The three men who died on February 3, 1959, were more than just entertainers. They were pioneers who helped create the soundtrack for a generation coming of age in post-war America. Their music provided the background for countless personal moments, first dances, teenage romance, family gatherings, and the simple joy of hearing something new and exciting on the radio. The fact that their careers were cut short at such young ages adds poignancy to their legacy, but also raises questions about what they might have accomplished if they had lived. Holly was already experimenting with new sounds and production techniques that might have led rock and roll in different directions. Valens was just beginning to explore his cultural heritage in his music. Richardson was developing his entertainment persona, and might have become a major multimedia personality. The day the music died remains one of the most significant single events in popular music history, not just because of who died but because of what their deaths represented. The tragedy marked the end of rock and roll's innocent early period, and the beginning of its evolution into something more complex, more aware of its own mortality, and more conscious of the serious responsibilities that come with cultural influence. Today, more than 60 years after the crash, the music of Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper continues to inspire new artists and delight new audiences. Their recordings remain fresh and vital, proof that truly great art transcends the circumstances of its creation and the mortality of its creators.
The day the music died may have ended three promising lives, but it could not silence the music they left behind, which continues to bring joy, inspiration, and cultural connection to listeners around the world. The tragedy serves as a permanent reminder that behind every song on the radio, every concert performance, and every moment of musical joy are real human beings with dreams, fears, families, and futures that can be changed or ended in an instant. The story of February 3, 1959 honors not just three specific artists but all the musicians who risked their lives literally and figuratively to bring music to the world.